You know, there's something fascinating about the 7 deadly sins. Even if you've never stepped foot in a church, you've probably heard of them. They show up in movies, in literature, in art galleries across the world. Pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. 7 simple words that somehow capture the complexity of human struggle. But here's what's interesting, and this might surprise you. If you were to sit down and read through the entire Bible, cover to cover, you'd never find these 7 sins listed out together in a neat little package. Not in the Old Testament, not in the New Testament, not in the words of Jesus, not in Paul's letters. Nowhere does Scripture say, here are the 7 deadly sins, memorize them for the test. So where did they come from? And why do they matter so much? Let me take you on a journey through the early church, through centuries of spiritual wisdom, and into the very heart of what makes us human. The 7 deadly sins, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth, didn't appear overnight. They emerged gradually, like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom. Early Christian teachers, the desert fathers and mothers who retreated into the wilderness of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries, they were the ones who started noticing patterns. These men and women, imagine them living in caves, in simple cells, spending their days in prayer and contemplation. They weren't just running away from the world. They were running towards something deeper. And in that deep silence, in that solitude, they began to see things about human nature that the noise of everyday life had hidden. They noticed that certain thoughts, certain desires, kept coming back. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. Like weeds in a garden, no matter how many times you pulled them up, they'd return. And they began to catalog these thoughts, these temptations. At first, there were 8 of them. A monk named Evagrius Ponticus, writing in the 4th century, identified 8 evil thoughts, or logismoi, as he called them in Greek. But it was Pope Gregory the Great, several centuries later in the 6th century, who refined the list down to 7. He combined some, reordered others, and gave us the framework we know today. Why 7? Well, 7 was a number of completeness in biblical thought. 7 days of creation. 7 seals. 7 churches. It suggested something total, something comprehensive. Now you might wonder, why are they called deadly sins? Does that mean if you commit one of them, you're done for? Are you immediately condemned? Not quite. The term deadly or mortal in Christian theology has a specific meaning. These sins are deadly because, if embraced fully and without repentance, they can kill the life of grace in the soul. They're called deadly because they have the power to spiritually destroy us, to separate us from Yahweh's love and presence. But there's another term that's equally important: capital sins. This comes from the Latin word caput, which means head. Think of a capital city. It's the head, the source, from which everything else flows. These 7 sins are capital sins because they're the heads, the sources, the roots from which all other sins spring. Let me put it this way. Imagine a tree. A massive oak tree with hundreds of branches, thousands of leaves. The 7 deadly sins? They're the roots. You might see the branches, the lies we tell, the people we hurt, the promises we break. Those are the visible sins, the fruits of something deeper. But if you really want to understand why that tree keeps producing bitter fruit, you have to look underground. You have to examine the roots. Pride is a root that produces the fruit of arrogance, of contempt for others, of refusing to admit when we're wrong. Greed is a root that produces hoarding, exploitation, the crushing of the vulnerable for profit. Lust produces adultery, pornography, the objectification of human beings made in Yahweh's image. Each of these 7 sins generates countless other sins and disorders in a person's life. The early church teachers understood something profound. You can spend your whole life trying to prune the branches, trying to fix individual problems, but if you don't address the root, the tree will just keep producing the same bitter fruit. So if these 7 sins aren't listed together in Scripture, does that mean they're unbiblical? Not at all. The Bible is full of warnings about each of these sins individually. The scriptural foundation is absolutely there. It's just scattered throughout the text like seeds in a field, waiting to be gathered. Proverbs 6 gives us a list of 7 things Yahweh hates: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. Sound familiar? Pride, violence, deceit, these overlap significantly with our 7 deadly sins. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, lists the acts of the flesh: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions and envy, drunkenness, orgies and the like. There's lust, there's envy, there's wrath, there's gluttony, all present in Paul's warning to the early church. Jesus himself, in the Sermon on the Mount, goes beyond the external acts to address the heart issues. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. He's pointing to lust, to the root, not just the fruit. The book of Proverbs repeatedly warns against pride. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. It counsels against greed. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. It cautions about anger. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. What the early church teachers did was essentially this: they read scripture thoroughly, they observed human nature carefully, and they noticed patterns. They saw that certain sins kept appearing together, kept feeding each other, kept showing up as the core struggles in spiritual life. And they organized this wisdom into a framework that could help believers understand their own hearts better. Think of the 7 deadly sins as a map. Not a map of some distant country, but a map of your own heart, of my heart, of every human heart that's ever beat. We all know what it's like to want recognition, to need to be seen as special, to struggle with admitting we were wrong. That's pride. We've all felt the gnawing desire for more money, more possessions, more security, even when we have enough. That's greed. We've all experienced desire that goes beyond appreciation into objectification, into using rather than loving. That's lust. We've looked at what someone else has, their talents, their relationships, their success, and felt that bitter twist in our gut. That's envy. We've sought comfort in excess, whether in food, in entertainment, in anything that numbs us to reality. That's gluttony. We've felt anger rise up in us, felt the desire to hurt someone who hurt us, to get even. That's wrath. And we've all known the heavy blanket of apathy, the reluctance to do what we know we should do, the spiritual laziness that keeps us from growing. That's sloth. These aren't just abstract theological concepts. They're the daily reality of being human in a broken world. But here's the beautiful thing, and this is why the church spent centuries developing this framework. When you can name something, when you can identify it, you can begin to address it. You can't fight an enemy you can't see. You can't pull up a weed you haven't identified. The 7 deadly sins give us language for our struggles. They help us see patterns in our behavior that we might otherwise miss. Now, traditionally, the 7 deadly sins have been emphasized more in Catholic teaching than in Protestant teaching, but the underlying theology is shared across most of Christian tradition. The Catholic Church developed a rich understanding of how these sins work, how they progress, how they relate to virtue and grace. In Catholic thought, these sins are particularly dangerous because they incline the heart away from Yahweh and toward the self. They're called capital because they're the leaders, the generals, if you will, of the army of sin. They're the ones that command all the others. Protestant tradition, while perhaps not emphasizing the specific list of 7 as much, absolutely affirms the same truths about human nature and sin. The reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin spoke extensively about the corruption of the human heart, about how sin isn't just about actions but about the fundamental orientation of the soul. Luther's concept of incurvatus in esse, the self curved in upon itself, is essentially describing what the 7 deadly sins catalog, the ways we turn inward rather than upward toward Yahweh and outward toward our neighbor. Both traditions agree on this. These sins are deadly serious. They're not minor infractions or personality quirks. They're the fundamental ways we rebel against Yahweh's design for human flourishing. You might be wondering, why does any of this matter today? We live in a world that often celebrates these very sins. Pride is rebranded as self-confidence. Greed is called ambition. Lust is marketed as liberation. Envy drives our consumer economy. Gluttony is just enjoying life. Wrath is standing up for yourself. And sloth? Well, we call that self-care. But deep down we know that pride isolates us. We know that greed never satisfies. We know that lust leaves us empty. We know that envy poisons our joy. We know that gluttony brings shame. We know that wrath destroys relationships. We know that sloth leads to regret. The 7 deadly sins are deadly because they promise life but deliver death. They promise satisfaction but deliver emptiness. They promise freedom but deliver bondage. And that's why, centuries after these desert monks and church fathers identified these patterns, we're still talking about them. Because they're still true. Because we still struggle with them. Because understanding them is the first step toward freedom from them. In the sections to come, we'll explore each of these sins in depth. We'll look at how they manifest, how they grow, how they disguise themselves. We'll examine biblical stories and real-life examples that bring them into sharp focus. And we'll discover that Yahweh, in His mercy, has provided a way through them, not around them but through them, into the life of virtue and grace He's always intended for us. Because that's the ultimate truth about the 7 deadly sins. They're not the end of the story. They're a diagnosis, yes. But Yahweh is in the business of healing, not just diagnosing. And that's very good news indeed. Picture this, the Egyptian desert in the 4th century. Miles and miles of sand, scorching sun, and silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. In caves and simple stone cells scattered across this vast emptiness, men and women have retreated from the world. They're not running away from something, well maybe they are, but more importantly, they're running toward something. Toward Yahweh. Toward truth. Toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. These are the desert fathers and mothers, and they're about to make a discovery that will shape Christian spirituality for the next 16 centuries and counting. But here's what's fascinating. When they started cataloging the 7 deadly sins, they weren't trying to create a rulebook for the average Christian. They weren't writing a moral code for society. They were doing something far more intimate, far more personal. They were mapping the landscape of the human soul. Imagine being one of these desert monks. You've left behind your family, your career, your possessions. You've stripped away all the distractions of city life. No social media to scroll through, no television to numb you, no busy schedule to hide behind. Just you, the desert, and Yahweh. And in that silence, something strange happens. You start to notice things. Thoughts that you could ignore when you were busy? They become deafening. Desires that were easy to brush aside when you had 1,000 distractions? They demand attention. The noise of the world had been drowning out the noise in your own heart, and now in the quiet, you can finally hear it. The desert monks called these thoughts logismoi in Greek. It's a word that literally means thoughts or reasoning, but it carried a deeper meaning. These were the thoughts that led you away from Yahweh, the mental patterns that, if followed, would lead to sin and spiritual death. This is crucial to understand. From the very beginning, this tradition was focused on the interior life, on what was happening in the mind and heart, not just on external actions. Anyone can avoid committing murder. But can you notice the moment when irritation becomes contempt? Can you catch the thought before it becomes the deed? Can you recognize the subtle shift from appreciation to lust, from wanting to coveting, from confidence to pride? The desert monks were spiritual physicians, and they were diagnosing diseases of the soul with the precision of a surgeon. One of the most important of these spiritual physicians was a monk named Evagrius Ponticus. Born around 345 AD, Evagrius was a brilliant theologian and a student of some of the greatest Christian teachers of his time. But brilliance wasn't enough. He needed the desert. He needed that silence. And in that silence, through years of prayer and self-examination, Evagrius identified 8 evil thoughts, 8 logismoi that seemed to be the root of all human spiritual struggle. His list went like this: gluttony, lust, avarice, which we'd call greed, sadness, anger, aestia, a kind of spiritual listlessness, vainglory, and pride. 8, not 7. And if you look closely, you'll notice some differences from the list we know today. Sadness? That's not in the modern list. Vainglory as separate from pride? That's interesting. And where's envy? Let me walk you through each of these original 8, because understanding them helps us see how the tradition developed. Gluttony came first in Evagrius's list, not because it was the worst sin, but because it was often the first battleground for monks. Think about it. These men and women were fasting, eating only bread and water, sometimes only eating every other day. The desire for food, for more, for better, for variety, this was the first temptation they had to face. And Evagrius understood that if you couldn't master your desire for food, how would you master the more subtle desires that would come later? Lust was next, another bodily desire, another appetite that the monks had to learn to recognize and redirect. In the solitude of the desert, without the normal outlets for sexual desire, without the distractions of romantic pursuit, the monks had to face this drive in its raw form. Avarice, or love of money, seems strange in a desert context. After all, these monks had renounced possessions. But Evagrius noticed that even in the desert, monks could become attached to their few belongings, could hoard little things, could find their security in having rather than in trusting Yahweh's provision. Sadness, in Evagrius's framework, wasn't just being sad. It was a kind of spiritual dejection, a sorrow that came from unmet desires, from regret over the life left behind, from disappointment with God or with oneself. It was the heavy cloud that made prayer feel impossible and hope feel distant. Anger was the passion that arose when things didn't go as the monk wanted. A difficult superior, a shortage of food, an interruption during prayer, these could trigger anger, and Evagrius saw how this anger could fester into resentment, into fantasies of revenge, into a hardness of heart. Aestia is a word we don't use much anymore, and that's a shame because it names something we all experience. It's often translated as sloth, but it's more than just laziness. It's a restlessness, a boredom with spiritual things, a desire to be anywhere but where you are, doing anything but what you should be doing. The desert monks called it the noonday demon, because it often hit in the middle of the day when the sun was hottest and the hours stretched endlessly ahead. It's that feeling of what's the point that makes you want to quit, to give up, to do literally anything else. Vainglory was the desire for human praise, for recognition, for being seen as holy or wise or impressive. Even in the desert, even in supposed solitude, monks struggled with this. They'd imagine crowds admiring their piety, they'd mentally compose sermons they might preach, they'd compare themselves favorably to other monks. It was pride, but focused specifically on reputation and recognition. And finally, pride itself, the root of all the others, the queen of sins. This was the fundamental orientation of the self toward the self, the belief that you don't need Yahweh, that you are sufficient, that you are the center of the universe. Pride told the monk that his spiritual progress was his own achievement, that he didn't really need grace, that he was better than others. Now, Evagrius's list was influential. It spread throughout the monasteries of the East and eventually to the West. But it wasn't the final form. Lists evolved, different teachers emphasized different aspects, and the framework continued to be refined. The big shift came with Pope Gregory I, known to history as Gregory the Great, who served as pope from 590 to 604 AD. Gregory was a remarkable man, a former monk himself, a gifted administrator, a prolific writer, and one of the most influential popes in history. He's one of the four great Latin fathers of the Church, and his theological work shaped Western Christianity for centuries. Gregory took Evagrius's 8 thoughts and did some reorganizing. He combined some, separated others, and arrived at the list of 7 that we know today: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. What changed? Let's track the evolution. Sadness was dropped from the list, not because it wasn't a real struggle, but because Gregory saw it as more of a result of other sins rather than a root itself. When you're enslaved to greed and you don't get what you want, you feel sad. When pride is wounded, sadness follows. It wasn't a capital sin in itself. Vainglory was folded into pride. Gregory recognized that vainglory, the desire for human recognition, was really just a specific manifestation of pride. Instead of having them as separate categories, he combined them. Pride became the comprehensive term for all the ways we make ourselves the center, whether we're seeking glory from others or from ourselves. Envy was added as its own category. While Evagrius had mentioned envious thoughts, Gregory elevated envy to the status of a capital sin. He saw that envy, the resentment of another person's good, the desire for them to lose what they have, was a distinct spiritual poison that needed to be named and confronted. Aestia became sloth, and the concept was broadened. It still included that spiritual restlessness and boredom, but it also encompassed physical laziness and the refusal to do the good that one ought to do. Sloth became both a spiritual and a practical category. The result was a tighter, more memorable list. 7 sins instead of 8. 7, that perfect biblical number. 7 deadly sins that would become the framework for understanding human fallenness for the next 14 centuries. But Gregory didn't just revise the list. He gave us a powerful metaphor for understanding how these sins work together. He described pride as a queen, powerful, commanding, seated on a throne, and the other 6 deadly sins as her generals, her army commanders, going out to conquer territory in the human heart. Think about that image for a moment. Pride is the queen. She doesn't do the dirty work herself. She sits in her palace, secure in her power, and she sends out her generals to do her bidding. Greed goes out to capture resources. Lust goes out to capture bodies. Envy goes out to poison relationships. Gluttony goes out to enslave the appetites. Wrath goes out to destroy opposition. Sloth goes out to paralyze the will. And all of them report back to Queen Pride. All of them serve her purposes. All of them advance her kingdom. This is why Gregory, and the Christian tradition following him, identified pride as the root of all sin. It's not just first among equals. It's the source. The Bible itself tells us this in the book of Sirach. Pride is the beginning of all sin. When Lucifer fell, it was pride that brought him down. When Adam and Eve ate the fruit, it was the pride of wanting to be like God, knowing good and evil for themselves, making themselves the ultimate authority. Every other sin flows from this fundamental misdirection of the heart. Greed says, I deserve more. That's pride. Lust says, my desire matters more than this person's dignity. That's pride. Envy says, I should have what they have. Pride again. Gluttony says, I will satisfy myself, regardless of the consequences. Pride. Wrath says, I will be the judge, I will execute punishment. Pride. Sloth says, I will decide what's worth my effort, not God. Still pride. Queen Pride sits at the center of it all, directing her generals, expanding her kingdom in the human heart. Now, here's something important to remember. When Evagrius first catalogued these thoughts, when Gregory refined them into the 7 deadly sins, they weren't creating a catechism for ordinary Christians. This wasn't meant to be taught to children in Sunday school. This was a diagnostic tool for serious spiritual practitioners, monks who had already committed their entire lives to pursuing Yahweh. These were people who had time for deep introspection, who had the luxury of silence and solitude to examine their hearts with microscopic precision. The 7 deadly sins were like a spiritual physician's chart, subtle symptoms that only a trained eye could spot. But something beautiful happened over the centuries. What started as a tool for spiritual elites became a gift for everyone. The Church recognized that these patterns weren't unique to monks. They were universal. Every human heart, whether in a desert cave or a city apartment, struggled with these same fundamental misdirections. So the 7 deadly sins moved from the monastery to the cathedral, from the spiritual masters to the common faithful. They became part of sermons, part of art, part of the basic moral framework that Christians use to examine their consciences. Dante built his entire Divine Comedy around them, creating elaborate circles of purgatory where souls were purified of each deadly sin in turn. Medieval artists depicted them in sculpture and stained glass. Preachers used them to help people understand why they kept falling into the same patterns, why confession felt like repeating the same sins over and over. And the framework worked because it was true. Because a peasant farmer in medieval France struggled with pride and envy, just like a desert monk in 4th century Egypt. Because a merchant in Renaissance Italy battled greed and wrath, just like we do today in 21st century America. But through all these developments, through all the centuries of refinement and popularization, the tradition never lost that original insight from the desert. This is about the interior life. The 7 deadly sins aren't ultimately about actions. They're about thoughts, about patterns, about the orientation of the heart. You can refrain from every external sin on the books and still be completely enslaved to pride. You can follow every rule and miss the whole point. This is what made the framework so powerful and so challenging. It's one thing to say don't steal, don't lie, don't murder. It's another thing entirely to say examine the thoughts that lead to stealing, trace the pattern that produces lies, understand the anger that fantasizes about murder. The 7 deadly sins force us to ask uncomfortable questions. Not just what did I do wrong, but why do I keep doing this? What's the root? What's the pattern? What am I protecting? What am I trying to achieve? When Gregory called these sins capital, from the Latin caput, meaning head, he was saying that these are the heads, the sources, the fountains from which all other sins flow. You can spend your whole life managing symptoms, trying to stop the particular sins that keep tripping you up, or you can go to the source. You can identify which of these 7 roots is feeding your particular tree of sin. What the Desert Fathers and Mothers discovered, what Evagrius catalogued, what Gregory refined and popularized, this wasn't abstract theology. This was lived wisdom, earned through years of prayer and struggle and honest self-examination. They watched their own hearts like a scientist watches an experiment. They noticed patterns. They saw how one thought led to another, how one indulgence made the next one easier, how one compromise opened the door to a dozen more. And they wrote it down, not to condemn, but to illuminate. Not to shame, but to help. When we read their work today, when we explore the 7 deadly sins, we're not reading the theories of armchair philosophers. We're reading the field notes of explorers who ventured into the darkest territory there is, the human heart, and came back with a map. That map has been refined over 16 centuries. It's been tested by millions of believers across every culture and context. And it's still reliable. It still helps us navigate. It still shows us where the dangers are and where the path to freedom lies. Because here's the beautiful truth: Yahweh didn't reveal these patterns of sin just to make us feel guilty. He revealed them so we could be free. You can't escape a prison you don't know you're in. You can't fight an enemy you can't see. The 7 deadly sins give us language for our struggles, categories for our temptations, a framework for understanding why we are the way we are. And once you can see the pattern, once you can name the sin, once you understand which root is feeding which fruit, that's when transformation becomes possible. That's when grace can do its work. That's when the healing can begin. In the sections ahead, we'll explore each of these 7 sins in depth. We'll see how they manifest, how they disguise themselves, how they work together. We'll look at biblical examples and real-life stories. We'll trace the pattern from the first subtle thought to the devastating final consequence. But always, we'll remember this: the goal isn't condemnation. The goal is freedom. The goal is to see clearly so we can walk wisely. The goal is to understand the diagnosis so we can receive the cure. Because Yahweh is still in the healing business. And that's the best news of all. There's a reason why pride sits at the top of the list. Not alphabetically, it doesn't start with a, but theologically, spiritually, fundamentally. Pride is the first sin, the original sin, the sin from which all others flow like tributaries from a poisoned spring. When Lucifer, the morning star, the most beautiful of all angels, fell from heaven, it wasn't because he stole something or murdered someone or committed some external act of rebellion. It was pride. "I will ascend to heaven," he said according to the prophet Isaiah. "I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High." 5 I wills in opposition to Yahweh's will. That's pride in its purest, most concentrated form. And when humanity fell, when Adam and Eve stood in the Garden of Eden with everything they could possibly need, literally walking with Yahweh in the cool of the day, what was it that made them reach for the forbidden fruit? The serpent's promise: "You will be like God, knowing good and evil." The offer to be self-sufficient, to be the ultimate authority, to not need Yahweh's wisdom because they would have their own. Pride. Always pride. At the root of every rebellion, every sin, every turning away from Yahweh, you'll find pride whispering its seductive lie: you don't need him. You're enough on your own. But let's be clear about what we're talking about, because pride is a tricky word in our language. We say we're proud of our kids, proud of our work, proud of our team. We talk about taking pride in a job well done. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of pride. That's really just satisfaction, appreciation, healthy self-respect. The deadly sin of pride is something different entirely. It's not about feeling good about genuine accomplishment. It's about an excessive, disordered love of self. It's placing yourself at the center of the universe where only Yahweh belongs. It's the belief, sometimes subtle, sometimes blatant, that you're better than others, that you deserve more than others, that the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to you. St. Augustine called it the love of one's own excellence. Thomas Aquinas described it as an inordinate desire for one's own excellence. C.S. Lewis, in his brilliant essay on pride, called it the complete anti-God state of mind. Pride says, "I don't need anyone." Pride says, "I'm always right." Pride says, "My way is the best way." Pride says, "I deserve this." And underneath all of those statements is the fundamental assertion: I am God. I am the measure of all things. I am the standard by which everything else should be judged. It's the most spiritual of sins because it directly challenges Yahweh's sovereignty. You can commit adultery and still acknowledge God's authority. You know you're breaking his law, even as you do it. But pride says there is no authority above the self. Pride is the ultimate rebellion. Let me tell you a story about how pride works, how it grows, how it blinds us to reality until reality comes crashing down around us. There was once a celebrated king, a man who had built his entire identity on one unshakable foundation: he never lost. Not a battle, not an argument, not a decision. His record was perfect, and he intended to keep it that way. At first, this served him well. His confidence inspired his troops. His decisiveness impressed his court. His unwavering certainty seemed like strength, and in the early years of his reign, it might have been. He won battles, expanded his territory, secured his borders. And with each victory, his pride grew a little more. But here's the thing about pride: it can't tolerate contradiction. It can't accept limitation. It absolutely cannot, under any circumstances, admit error. So when his most seasoned advisors came to him with a warning, a neighboring empire was too strong to attack, they were outnumbered, their supply lines couldn't support a campaign of that distance, the king didn't hear wisdom. He heard cowardice. He heard doubt. He heard a challenge to his perfect record. His best general, a man who had fought beside him for 20 years, presented detailed evidence. Maps showing the terrain. Reports on the enemy's numbers. Calculations of what their army would need versus what they could actually carry. It was all there, laid out with the precision of a man who had won 100 battles and knew exactly what victory required. The king looked at all of it and saw only one thing: disloyalty. "You dare suggest I might fail," he said, his voice cold. "You dare imply that my judgment is flawed?" The general tried again, more gently this time. "My lord, I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm presenting information. We can win many battles, but this particular campaign, at this particular time, with these resources, it's not wise." But pride doesn't hear nuance. Pride hears only two options: agreement or betrayal. The king exiled his most seasoned general that very day. The charge? Cowardice. The real crime? Speaking a truth that pride couldn't accept. The king launched his campaign anyway, and at first it seemed to confirm everything he believed about himself. The initial battles went okay. Not great, but okay. And okay was enough for the king to declare vindication. "You see," he said to his remaining advisors, the ones who had learned to only tell him what he wanted to hear. "They said it couldn't be done. They said we'd fail. But here we are, advancing, winning." He didn't see, or chose not to see, that okay wasn't good enough. He didn't notice that his supply lines were already strained. He didn't pay attention to the reports of disease spreading through the ranks. He didn't consider that the enemy was simply drawing him deeper into their territory, stretching his army thinner and thinner. When new reports came in, supply shortages, mounting casualties, low morale, the king dismissed them. "Excuses," he said, "from men who lack my vision." This is what pride does. It creates an alternate reality. It constructs a world where you're always right, always winning, always vindicated. And it maintains that world by rejecting any information that doesn't fit the narrative. The king's advisors learned quickly. Tell him good news, get rewarded. Tell him bad news, risk exile or worse. So they told him good news. They inflated victory reports and minimized losses. They assured him that everything was going according to plan. And the king believed them because believing them allowed him to stay in the reality where he was never wrong. But reality doesn't care about your pride. Reality doesn't adjust itself to fit your self-image. Reality just is. The defeat, when it came, was catastrophic. The enemy had been patient, letting the king overextend himself, and then they struck with overwhelming force. The king's army, already weakened by disease and supply shortages, already demoralized by senseless orders from a commander who cared more about looking decisive than about actual strategy, simply fell apart. But even then, even as his army was being destroyed, the king couldn't admit the truth. He issued more orders, each one more disconnected from reality than the last. Attack here. Retreat there. Hold this position. Abandon that one. The orders contradicted each other, made no tactical sense, but they had one thing in common: they allowed the king to look like he was in control. His remaining commanders faced an impossible choice: obey the king's suicidal orders and watch their men die, or disobey and try to save what they could. No one dared report the scale of the disaster back to the capital. The culture of pride the king had created punished truth-telling. So the court went on as if everything was fine, even as the army was being slaughtered hundreds of miles away. Remember that exiled general? The one who had dared to speak truth to power? He was living quietly in a remote province when the refugees started arriving. Soldiers who had deserted rather than die in a campaign that made no sense. Civilians fleeing the war zone. All of them with the same story: the king's pride had doomed them all. The general could have stayed in exile. He could have said, "I warned him. Not my problem anymore." Pride would have said that. Pride would have nursed the grudge, savored the vindication, watched the kingdom burn and said, "They should have listened to me." But the general wasn't motivated by pride. He was motivated by love, love for his men, love for his people, love for the kingdom he had served all his life. So when the king's last message arrived, a suicidal order to make a final stand against impossible odds, purely so the king could claim his army had never retreated, the general disobeyed. He gathered the survivors, organized a fighting retreat, and brought them home. He saved hundreds of lives by refusing to sacrifice them on the altar of the king's pride. When the general finally led the column of refugees back to the capital, the king saw him from his palace walls. Saw the bedraggled soldiers, the wounded, the exhausted. Saw the scale of the disaster that his pride had created. And for just a moment, just one brief flickering moment, the king's carefully constructed reality cracked. He saw the truth. He saw what his pride had cost. But even then, he couldn't say it. Couldn't say, "I was wrong." Couldn't say, "I'm sorry." Couldn't say, "I should have listened." Because pride would rather watch everything burn than admit error. Pride would rather lose a kingdom than lose face. The kingdom survived, but it was never the same. The people never again believed that the king's word was equal to truth. The illusion of infallibility, the very thing his pride most valued, was shattered beyond repair. And the general? He never spoke ill of the king. He never said, "I told you so." He just quietly rebuilt what could be rebuilt, served where he could serve, and carried the sorrow of knowing that so much suffering could have been prevented if only one man had been able to say 3 simple words: "I was wrong." This story, this tragic familiar story, shows us the pattern of pride. And if we're honest, we can see it in our own lives, maybe not on the scale of kingdoms and armies, but in the small daily rebellions against truth and humility. Pride starts with an identity built on performance. I'm the person who never loses. I'm the one who's always right. I'm the smartest one in the room. We all have these identities, these self-concepts that we cling to. And then pride protects that identity at all costs. When information threatens our self-image, we reject the information instead of adjusting the image. We exile the truth-tellers. We surround ourselves with yes-men. We create echo chambers where we only hear what confirms what we already believe. Pride interprets all disagreement as disloyalty. If you question my judgment, you're against me. If you point out my error, you're my enemy. Pride can't distinguish between the person and the idea, between challenging a decision and challenging the decision-maker's worth. Pride doubles down when wrong rather than admitting error. It issues more orders, makes more pronouncements, digs the hole deeper, all in service of avoiding the simple admission, "I made a mistake." And finally, pride destroys what it was trying to protect. The king wanted to be seen as infallible, so he couldn't admit fallibility, and that very refusal destroyed his reputation more thoroughly than any honest mistake ever could have. The Bible is full of warnings about pride, and full of stories showing its destruction. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, walking on his palace roof, said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" Before the words were out of his mouth, Yahweh struck him with madness, and he spent 7 years living like an animal until he learned that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. King Uzziah of Judah, who started well, became proud. 2 Chronicles tells us that when he was strong, he grew proud, to his destruction. He insisted on entering the temple to burn incense, a role reserved for priests. When the priests confronted him, his pride turned to wrath, and Yahweh struck him with leprosy on the spot. Proverbs 16 verse 18 gives us the famous warning, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." And it's not just a nice saying, it's an observed pattern of reality. Pride really does come before a fall. Always. Every time. In the New Testament, Jesus tells a parable about a Pharisee and a tax collector praying in the temple. The Pharisee stands and prays about himself, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get." The tax collector stands at a distance, won't even look up to heaven, and beats his breast saying, "God have mercy on me, a sinner." Jesus says the tax collector went home justified before Yahweh, not the Pharisee. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The Pharisee's pride blinded him to his own spiritual poverty. He thought he was rich, righteous, and approved. He had no idea how desperately he needed grace, because pride can't see its own need. But here's what makes pride so dangerous: it's subtle. It disguises itself. It doesn't usually announce itself with a crown and a scepter. Pride can look like perfectionism. I can't accept anything less than perfect for myself. Sounds noble, right? But underneath it might be the refusal to be human, the refusal to need grace, the belief that you should be able to save yourself through performance. Pride can look like independence. I don't need anyone's help. We admire self-sufficiency, but when it becomes an absolute refusal to accept help, to admit need, to acknowledge dependence, that's pride. Pride can look like humility. Yes, really. False humility that constantly talks about how unworthy it is, how terrible its sins are, that's often just pride in disguise, pride that wants credit for its amazing humility, pride that's still making everything about the self. Pride can look like conviction. I'm just standing up for what's right. But when you can't admit you might be wrong, when you can't listen to other perspectives, when you're so certain that anyone who disagrees must be either evil or stupid, that's pride, not conviction. Pride whispers, "You're special. You're different. The normal rules don't apply to you. You're above that. You're beyond that." And we believe it because, deep down, we want to believe it. Remember Pope Gregory's metaphor of pride as the queen sending out her generals? Every other deadly sin serves pride. Greed says, "I deserve more than I have." That's pride deciding it knows better than Yahweh what you need. Envy says, "I should have what they have." That's pride unable to accept Yahweh's different plans for different people. Wrath says, "I have the right to judge and punish." That's pride taking Yahweh's role as judge. Lust says, "My desire matters more than another person's dignity." That's pride putting self at the center. Gluttony says, "I will indulge myself without limit." That's pride refusing the discipline that acknowledges you're not God. Sloth says, "I'll decide what deserves my effort." That's pride refusing to submit to duty or calling. They all flow from the same poison spring, the belief that I am the center, I am the measure, I am the ultimate authority. And that belief is, quite simply, a lie. The most destructive, most persistent, most seductive lie in human history. So what's the answer? How do we escape the gravity of pride? The same way that tax collector in Jesus' parable did. By telling the truth about ourselves. God have mercy on me, a sinner. Not a sinner, but not as bad as most. Not a sinner, but I'm working on it and making great progress. Just a sinner. In need. Dependent. Unable to save myself. Humility is simply seeing and accepting reality. You are a creature, not the creator. You are dependent, not self-sufficient. You are finite, limited, capable of error. You need Yahweh. You need grace. You need other people. You need help. And here's the beautiful paradox: admitting that doesn't diminish you. It frees you. The king in our story was imprisoned by his pride. He couldn't learn because he couldn't admit he didn't know. He couldn't change because he couldn't admit he was wrong. He couldn't receive help because he couldn't admit he needed it. His pride, which he thought made him strong, actually made him weak, brittle, fragile. The general, humble enough to be corrected, humble enough to serve even after being exiled, humble enough to disobey when obedience would mean needless death, he was free. Free to act wisely. Free to serve truly. Free to save lives. Jesus said it plainly, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Let go of the pride-driven need to be always right, always best, always in control, and you'll find real life, real freedom, real strength. There's an old saying, money can't buy happiness. And yet, we spend our lives acting as if it can. As if just a little bit more would finally be enough. As if the next promotion, the next purchase, the next investment would finally satisfy the hunger. Greed, avarice, as it's traditionally called, is a disordered love of riches and possessions. It's when material gain becomes more important than Yahweh, more important than neighbor, more important than everything that actually makes life worth living. But here's what makes greed so insidious. It doesn't usually look like evil. It looks like ambition. It looks like success. It looks like being smart with your resources. It wraps itself in the language of responsibility, of providing for your family, of financial security. And all the while, it's quietly hollowing out your soul from the inside. Let me tell you a story about how this happens. About how something that starts good can be corrupted by greed so gradually, so subtly, that you don't even realize what you've lost until it's gone. There was a small tech startup, just a couple of developers with an idea and a dream. They'd noticed something in their neighborhood. People had stuff they didn't need, and other people needed stuff they didn't have. Someone had extra tomatoes from their garden. Someone else needed tomatoes but had extra eggs. One person had a drill they used twice a year. A dozen people needed to use a drill but didn't want to buy one. So they built an app. Simple, elegant, beautiful. It let neighbors share with neighbors. Extra food, tools, rides, services. All free. All based on the old-fashioned idea that communities thrive when people help each other out. And it worked. Oh, it worked beautifully. An elderly woman who couldn't cook big meals anymore started posting her extra portions on the app. A young mother struggling to feed her kids would pick them up with gratitude. A teenager with a car and too much free time started offering rides to seniors who couldn't drive anymore. A guy with every tool imaginable opened up his garage like a lending library. The app didn't create generosity, that was already there in people's hearts. But it facilitated it, organized it, made it easy. Within months, the neighborhood felt different. People knew each other. They waved. They helped. They cared. The founders watched this happen and felt something that money can't buy, the deep satisfaction of having made the world a little bit better. Then the investors came knocking. "We love what you've built," they said. "We can help you scale this. Think bigger. Not just one neighborhood, every neighborhood. Not just sharing, a whole platform. We see the potential here." They talked about growth. They talked about impact. They talked about all the good that could be done if only the app reached more people. And they talked about money. Lots of money. The founders hesitated. "We didn't build this to make money," they said. "We built it to help people." "But you can do both," the investors replied. And that's the lie greed always tells. You can serve God and money. You can chase profit and still help people. You can monetize everything and somehow keep the heart of it pure. The founders wanted to believe it. They liked the idea of financial security. They liked the validation that came with investor interest. And honestly, they liked imagining what they could do with real resources. So they took the money. And with the money came expectations. We need to see user engagement metrics. We need monthly active users trending up. We need to demonstrate a path to profitability. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the language changed. Neighbors became users. Acts of generosity became transactions. Community became engagement metrics. People became numbers on a spreadsheet, and those numbers needed to go up. The optimization of everything. The first changes were small, barely noticeable. "We're adding some premium features," the founders announced, "just to cover server costs. Priority placement for your shares. The ability to boost your posts. Advanced notification settings. Nothing major. Still mostly free." But then came the algorithm. Oh, the algorithm. "We need to optimize engagement," the product team said. And what drives engagement? Scarcity. Competition. The fear of missing out. So the algorithm started prioritizing certain types of shares. Posts from paying users appeared first. Posts from free users got pushed down. And down. And down. A woman who used to reliably find free food for her elderly neighbor started seeing fewer and fewer genuine sharing posts. Instead, her feed filled with premium opportunities, people selling things, not sharing them. Flash deals. Limited time offers. Subscribe now for priority access. The app introduced ShareCoins, a virtual currency that let you earn credits for sharing, which you could then spend to access better shares. Suddenly, people weren't sharing out of generosity. They were calculating. If I share this, I'll earn enough coins to get that thing I want. Generosity became transactional. Community became a marketplace. And here's the tragic thing, it worked. By every metric that matters to investors, it worked brilliantly. Monthly active users? Up. Transaction volume? Up. Revenue? Way up. The company was on a growth trajectory that had venture capitalists salivating. But something else was happening too, something the metrics couldn't capture. People started hoarding instead of sharing. Why give away your extra drill bits when you could sell them for share coins? Why offer a free ride when you could charge a voluntary contribution? The guy who used to lend tools freely started charging rental fees. I have to, he explained, a bit sheepishly. Everyone else is. If I don't, the algorithm buries my posts and nobody sees them anyway. The teenager offering free rides to seniors? The app suggested he could make serious income if he just added a suggested donation feature. Before long, seniors who couldn't afford even small fees stopped requesting rides. The young mother who used to get free food for her kids? Now every third post in her feed was an ad. Every notification was a limited time opportunity to subscribe. The actual sharing posts were there technically, but buried under layers of monetization. The elderly neighbor she used to help quietly started skipping meals because navigating the app had become too confusing, too expensive, too transactional. She missed the days when her young friend would just knock on the door with a warm plate of food. No app, no fees, no algorithm, just kindness. The founder, meanwhile, was on a conference circuit, giving talks about disrupting generosity and scaling community. The pitch deck was impressive. The growth charts pointed up and to the right. Investment rounds kept getting bigger. But negative stories started to surface. An investigative journalist talked to elderly users who'd been charged hidden fees they didn't understand. A local mutual aid group wrote an op-ed about how the app had actually destroyed their community's culture of sharing. A documentary filmmaker tracked what happened to neighborhoods before and after the app arrived. More transactions, yes, but less actual connection. The founder dismissed these as outliers. You can't please everyone, he told his board. Some people just don't understand technology. But he knew. Deep down he knew. He remembered the early days. He remembered the woman who cried because a stranger had brought her groceries when she was sick. He remembered the community barbecues that spontaneously organized through the app. He remembered what it felt like to build something that brought people together instead of something that extracted value from them. He remembered when he saw users as people instead of monetizable units. Then came the day the servers went down. A massive outage. Nothing worked. No app, no sharing, no algorithm, no premium features. Just nothing. And something remarkable happened in that silence. People had to coordinate the old-fashioned way. Knock on doors. Make phone calls. Actually talk to each other. The guy with the tools put a sign in his yard, "Free tool library, help yourself." No app needed. The teenager offering rides just started a group text with the seniors in the neighborhood. Anyone need anything today? The young mother knocked on her elderly neighbor's door. I made too much soup. Want some? And people realized something they'd forgotten. They were kinder before. More generous before. More connected before the app optimized their relationships. One of the seniors put it perfectly. We used to help each other because it was the right thing to do. Then we helped each other to earn points. Now we're not sure why we're helping each other at all. When the servers came back online, something had shifted. People started using the app less. The old-fashioned methods, the ones that felt more human, more real, more generous, started making a comeback. The company is still profitable. The metrics still trend upward. The investors are still happy. On paper, it's a success story. But the brand name, once synonymous with community and sharing, has become something else. It's become shorthand for what happens when greed gets its hands on something good. For how the drive for profit can hollow out beauty from the inside. For how optimization can destroy the very thing it claims to improve. The founder still gives talks. Still pitches investors. Still announces new features. But late at night, when he's alone with his thoughts, he wonders, when did helping neighbors share become maximizing user lifetime value? When did people become data points? When did community become content? When did generosity become a feature to monetize? And the answer, the terrible answer, is this: so gradually that he never noticed. One small compromise at a time. One reasonable business decision after another. Each one defensible. Each one rational. Each one moving a little further from the original vision, until the vision itself was unrecognizable. Greed doesn't usually announce itself. It doesn't usually look like Scrooge McDuck swimming in a vault of gold coins. It looks like smart business. It looks like sustainable growth. It looks like we're just being realistic. But the fruit is the same. Relationships become transactions. People become resources. Community becomes a market. And something precious is lost. Jesus talked about money more than almost any other topic. More than heaven, more than hell, more than prayer. Why? Because he knew. He knew how easily wealth becomes an idol. How quickly having enough turns into needing more. No one can serve two masters, Jesus said. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Not it's difficult to serve both. Not you probably shouldn't try to serve both. Cannot. It's impossible. The two masters demand opposite things. Yahweh says give, greed says take. Yahweh says trust, greed says hoard. Yahweh says people matter most, greed says profits matter most. The Apostle Paul puts it even more bluntly in his first letter to Timothy: the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Not money itself, the love of money, the disordered attachment, the making of wealth into a god. And notice what it does: it causes people to wander from faith and pierce themselves with grief. Greed doesn't make you happy. It promises satisfaction and delivers anxiety. It promises security and delivers fear. It promises fulfillment and delivers emptiness. There's a story in the Gospels about a rich young man who comes to Jesus. He's earnest, sincere, seeking. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus tells him, keep the commandments. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, honor your parents. All these I have kept since I was a boy, the young man says. And he probably had. He was a good person. Moral. Upright. Successful. But Jesus sees deeper. Jesus sees the one thing this man loves more than Yahweh. So he says, one thing you lack. Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. And the young man goes away sad, because he had great wealth. Mark tells us that Jesus looked at him and loved him before giving him this hard word. It wasn't cruelty. It was mercy. It was Jesus trying to free this man from the thing that was enslaving him. But the man couldn't do it. His wealth had him. He thought he owned his possessions, but really, his possessions owned him. That's what greed does. It enslaves even as it promises freedom. It imprisons even as it promises security. Greed doesn't usually start with, I want to be wealthy and I don't care who I hurt. It starts with, I just want to be secure. It starts with reasonable goals. Save for retirement. Buy a house. Provide for your family. Nothing wrong with any of that. But somewhere along the way, enough becomes a moving target. You get the promotion, but now you need a bigger house. You get the bigger house, but now you need nicer furniture. You get the nicer furniture, but now you need a second home. Always one more thing. Always just a little bit more. And slowly, imperceptibly, your relationship with money changes. You start making decisions based primarily on financial considerations. Should I take this job? Well, what does it pay? Should I move to this city? Well, what's the cost of living? Should I help this person? Well, can I afford it? Notice how those questions aren't wrong, exactly, but they're incomplete. The only metric is money. Not, is this job meaningful? Not, would this city be good for my soul? Not, does this person need help? Money becomes the lens through which everything is evaluated. You start seeing people differently. This person can help my career. This person can't do anything for me. This connection might be useful. This relationship has no value. You start treating your own gifts and talents as commodities to be maximized, rather than as gifts from Yahweh to be stewarded for the good of others. You start calculating everything. What's in it for me? What's the return on investment? What's my cut? And one day you wake up and realize, you're rich maybe. You're successful, possibly. But you're also lonely. And anxious. And never satisfied. And you've turned everything beautiful in your life, relationships, community, generosity, love, into a transaction. But it doesn't have to be this way. There's an alternative to greed, and it's not poverty, it's generosity. Generosity is the virtue that directly opposes greed. It's the recognition that everything you have is a gift from Yahweh, to be stewarded for His purposes and shared with others. Generous people still work hard. They still earn money. They still provide for their families. But their relationship with wealth is fundamentally different. They hold things loosely. They can give things away without feeling diminished. They can see someone else succeed without feeling threatened. They can share without calculating what they'll get back. They know that their security doesn't come from their bank account, it comes from Yahweh's faithfulness. They know that their worth doesn't come from their net worth, it comes from being made in Yahweh's image. They know that true abundance isn't measured in possessions, it's measured in love, in connection, in meaning, in purpose. The early church practiced this in a radical way. Acts tells us that all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Not because they were commanded to, not because it was required, but because when you're filled with the Spirit, when you truly understand that you're part of one body, greed loses its grip. You can't hoard when you see your neighbor's need as your own. You can't optimize for profit when you value people more than money. You can't turn community into a marketplace when you're experiencing real community for the first time. Here's the question that exposes greed every time: how much is enough? If you're driven by greed, you literally cannot answer that question. There is no enough. There's always more to acquire, more to achieve, more to secure. But if you're living generously, with proper order in your loves, you can say, this is enough. Enough for my needs, enough to be generous with, enough to share, enough to live well and help others do the same. Jesus told a parable about a rich man whose land produced a great harvest. The man thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. So he decided, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink and be merry. But Yahweh said to him, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And Jesus concludes, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God. The man's sin wasn't being wealthy. It wasn't having a good harvest. It was hoarding when he could have shared. It was building bigger barns instead of bigger tables. It was securing his own future without a thought for the people around him who had no future at all. Greed is subtle. It's culturally acceptable. It's praised as ambition, celebrated as success, admired as smart planning. But it's still a deadly sin. It still hollows out the soul. It still turns us into people we never meant to become. The good news, and there is good news, is that Yahweh is in the business of restoration, of healing our disordered loves, of teaching us to hold things loosely, to give generously, to find our security in Him rather than in our portfolios. It starts with honesty, with admitting that maybe we've loved money more than we've loved people, that maybe we've served wealth more than we've served Yahweh, that maybe we've built bigger barns when we should have built bigger hearts. And it continues with repentance, with turning, with choosing, one decision at a time, to be generous instead of greedy, to share instead of hoard, to value people over profit. It's not easy. Every commercial, every advertisement, every cultural message tells us to get more, want more, need more. But the way of Jesus is different. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, Jesus said, and all these things will be added to you. Trust Yahweh. Love people. Hold things loosely. Give generously. And discover that the life you gain is infinitely richer than anything greed ever promised. Of all the 7 deadly sins, lust might be the one our culture most struggles to call a sin at all. We've rebranded it as liberation, as self-expression, as sex positivity. We market it, monetize it, celebrate it. We call it empowerment even as it enslaves. We call it connection even as it isolates. But lust, real lust, the deadly sin, isn't about appreciating beauty or experiencing legitimate sexual desire within its proper context. Lust is disordered desire. It's excessive craving for sexual pleasure separated from love, from commitment, from the recognition of another person's full humanity and dignity. Lust reduces people to bodies. It turns subjects into objects. It takes something that Yahweh designed to be beautiful, the sexual union of two people in covenant love, and twists it into something that uses and discards, that consumes and moves on, that satisfies momentarily and leaves emptiness in its wake. Let me tell you a story about how lust works in our modern world. About how it promises everything and delivers nothing. About how it feeds on attention and starves the soul. There was an influencer, let's be honest, we all know at least one, who had built a decent following with clever, light-hearted content. Comedy sketches, relatable observations about daily life, creative challenges. The content was good. The engagement was real. People genuinely enjoyed what they created. But then came the plateau. The numbers stopped growing. The views flatlined. The algorithm seemed to lose interest. And in the world of social media, where your worth is measured in followers and engagement, a plateau feels like death. Their manager noticed it too. "We need to shake things up," they said. "Try something different. Something that'll break through the noise." They looked at the analytics. They studied what was working for other creators. And the pattern was unmistakable. Sex sells. Always has, always will. Provocative content got clicks. Suggestive thumbnails got views. Flirtation got engagement. "Just lean into sex appeal a little bit," the manager suggested. "Not anything explicit. Just, give people what they want to see." It seemed harmless enough. A more revealing outfit here. A suggestive thumbnail there. Some playful innuendo in the captions. Nothing too much. Just enough to catch the eye, to stop the scroll, to make people click. And it worked. Oh, it worked spectacularly. The numbers exploded. Followers poured in by the thousands. Engagement rates soared. Every post became a viral hit. Brands that had ignored them before suddenly wanted partnerships. The comment section filled with fire emojis and heart eyes and enthusiastic praise. It felt intoxicating. Like a drug hitting the bloodstream for the first time. The dopamine rush of validation, of being wanted, of being desired. The influencer had always wanted to be seen, to be appreciated, to matter. And now, finally, they did. "See," the manager said, showing them the latest analytics. "This is what people want. This is what works. Why would we ever go back?" So they didn't go back. They went forward. Further. More. Always more. The outfits got more revealing. The poses got more suggestive. The live streams got more flirtatious. Every boundary they'd once had, "I'd never do that, that's too far, that crosses a line," got pushed a little further with each successful post. And the audience? The audience loved it. Or at least, their engagement metrics suggested they did. Comments flooded in. Likes poured in. Shares multiplied. The algorithm rewarded them with unprecedented reach. Success, by every measurable standard. They were winning the game. But something was changing in those comments. Something the influencer tried not to notice at first. The comments weren't about their creativity anymore. Weren't about their personality, their humor, their unique voice. The comments were about their body. Specific parts of their body. Rating them. Comparing them. Demanding more. Show more skin. Love the outfit, but lose the top next time. Not as hot as last week's post. When are you going to do OnlyFans? The audience's interest had narrowed to a singular focus. They didn't see a person anymore. They saw a sexual object, and they wanted more explicit content. Always more explicit. The influencer started planning every post around one question: what will trigger another dopamine hit of lust-driven likes? What angle makes me look most desirable? What pose will get the most engagement? How can I be sexy enough to feed the algorithm without crossing the line into actual pornography? Their whole creative process, which had once been about making people laugh, about sharing observations, about connecting authentically, became a calculation of what would best trigger sexual desire in strangers. They were still in control, they told themselves. Still making choices. Still setting boundaries. This was empowerment, right? This was using their appeal strategically. This was just smart content creation. But late at night, scrolling through the comments, reading the increasingly explicit demands, they felt something they couldn't quite name. Not power. Not empowerment. Something closer to being consumed. The numbers kept going up, but something else started going down, real relationships. Their romantic partner, who had been supportive at first, started pulling away. I feel like you're not mine anymore, they said. You're performing for them. Even when we're alone, I can tell you're thinking about how to package this moment for content. The influencer tried to involve their partner, thinking it would help. Let's do couple content. People love that. We could make it spicy, get tons of engagement. But their partner felt objectified, reduced to a prop in a performance designed to trigger lust in strangers. This isn't intimacy, they said. This is exhibition. And I'm not interested in being part of your show. Friends started becoming distant too. Conversations felt calculated. Would this story work as content? Could they film this moment? Everything was being mined for sexy storylines, for flirtatious anecdotes, for anything that could be packaged and sold to an audience hungry for more. One friend finally said it directly, I don't think you even see me anymore. You see content. You see engagement metrics. But you don't see me. The influencer wanted to protest, to defend themselves, but the words caught in their throat. Because it was true, wasn't it? They'd started seeing everyone, including themselves, through the lens of how does this perform? And the thing about feeding lust, whether your own or other people's, is that it always demands escalation. What was shocking yesterday is boring today. What got engagement last week gets ignored this week. The audience always wants more, and more, and more. The influencer found themselves constantly pushing boundaries they'd once thought were firm. I'd never do that, they'd said 6 months ago about something they'd done last week. The comments proved it. This is tame. Getting boring. Not as good as you used to be. Used to be? This was the most revealing content they'd ever posted. But the audience's appetite had grown with the feeding. Lust is never satisfied. It consumes and demands more, always more. They stood in front of the camera one day, rehearsing their next live stream, and caught their own reflection. Who was this person? Where was the creator who used to make people laugh? Where was the person who valued authenticity over aesthetics, connection over clicks, meaning over metrics? And more troubling, where was the person underneath the performance? If they stopped performing sexuality, stopped feeding other people's lust, stopped calculating every post for maximum desire-driven engagement, what would be left? Did they even know anymore? They tried to pivot. Back to the old content. Back to the comedy, the creativity, the authentic connection. They posted a heartfelt video about mental health. About the pressure of social media. About wanting to be seen for more than their body. The engagement plummeted. Comments were sparse. The algorithm barely noticed. They posted a comedy sketch like they used to make. Put real effort into it. Thought it was genuinely funny. A fraction of their usual views. Comments asking when they'd post real content again. They tried educational content, inspirational content, meaningful content. Nothing. The audience that had gathered for sex appeal wasn't interested in anything else. They'd built a following based on lust, and that following expected lust. The brands that had wanted partnerships, they only wanted the sexy content. That's what your audience responds to, they said. That's your brand now. Their brand. Their identity. Reduced to how effectively they could trigger sexual desire in strangers. The story ends with them sitting in front of the camera, finger hovering over the go live button. They're wearing the outfit that gets the best engagement. They've practiced the poses that generate the most comments. They know exactly what to say, how to move, how to perform. And they're wrestling with a question they never thought they'd have to ask. If I stop feeding other people's lust, will there be anything left of me that they still want? Not will I still get engagement. Not will my numbers drop. Those answers are obvious. Yes and yes. But the deeper question, is there a me underneath the performance? A real person that people actually care about? Or have I turned myself into nothing but an object of desire, and that's all anyone wants from me now? And the even more terrifying question, is that all I want for myself? Because the truth, the awful honest truth, is that the dopamine rush of being lusted after had become addictive. The validation of being desired, even if that desire was shallow and objectifying, felt better than the vulnerability of being actually known and loved. Lust had promised connection but delivered isolation. It had promised empowerment but delivered enslavement. It had promised fulfillment but delivered emptiness. And now, sitting in front of that camera, they face the choice: keep feeding the beast, or starve it and discover if there's anything else left. This story, painfully modern, painfully relevant, illustrates what lust has always done throughout history. It reduces people to bodies. It turns subjects into objects. It fragments the human person, treating them as a collection of desirable parts rather than an integrated whole worthy of love and respect. Lust isn't about appreciating beauty. Yahweh created beauty, created bodies, created sexual attraction as good things. Within the covenant of marriage, sexual desire is not only permissible but celebrated. The Song of Solomon is in the Bible, after all, erotic poetry celebrating the beauty of marital love. But lust is what happens when sexual desire is separated from love, from commitment, from the recognition of the other person's full humanity. It's when you want someone's body without wanting their soul. When you desire pleasure without responsibility. When you consume without committing. The influencer's audience didn't love them. They lusted after them. They didn't want to know them. They wanted to use them, use the images, use the content, use the performance to feed their own disordered desires. And the influencer, in turn, was using the audience, using their lust to generate engagement, to build a platform, to gain validation. Everyone using everyone. Nobody truly loving anyone. That's the world lust creates. There's a story in the Gospel of John about Jesus meeting a Samaritan woman at a well. She'd come at noon, the hottest part of the day, when no one else would be there. Why? Because she'd been married 5 times and was currently living with a man who wasn't her husband. The other women in town judged her, whispered about her, shamed her. Jesus could have done the same. Could have condemned her promiscuity, lectured her about sexual morality, made her feel even worse about her choices. But he didn't. Instead, he offered her something she'd been searching for in all those relationships: living water. Real satisfaction. Genuine fulfillment. Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, Jesus said, gesturing to the well, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. She'd been trying to quench her thirst for love, for belonging, for significance through sexual relationships. And she was still thirsty. Always thirsty. Because lust never satisfies. It promises satisfaction and delivers craving. It promises fulfillment and delivers emptiness. Jesus saw her, really saw her. Not as a body to desire or a sinner to condemn, but as a person created in Yahweh's image, made for more than she'd settled for, worthy of genuine love and respect. And he offered her what lust never could, living water that actually satisfies. Jesus addressed lust directly in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This shocked his audience. They thought they were doing fine because they weren't actually sleeping around. But Jesus went deeper. He went to the heart. Lust isn't just about the external act. It's about the internal attitude. It's about looking at another person and reducing them to an object for your gratification. It's about the gaze that objectifies, the thought that dehumanizes, the desire that uses. And Jesus takes this so seriously that he says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. He's not being literal, he's being dramatic to make a point. Whatever it takes to stop lust from destroying you, do it. Cut off the source. Remove the temptation. Protect your heart and your eyes, because what you behold shapes who you become. We live in a culture absolutely saturated with lust. Pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry, more accessible than it's ever been in human history. With a few clicks, anyone, including children, can access images and videos designed specifically to trigger and exploit sexual desire. And the effects are devastating. Study after study shows that pornography consumption rewires the brain's reward circuitry, making real intimacy less satisfying, increases rates of erectile dysfunction in young men, correlates with higher rates of infidelity and divorce, contributes to sex trafficking and exploitation, creates unrealistic expectations that damage real relationships, trains users to view people as objects rather than persons. It's lust industrialized, lust commodified, lust reduced to a consumable product that you can access instantly, use up, and discard. And just like the influencer's audience, pornography users find themselves needing more and more extreme content to get the same dopamine hit. The appetite grows with the feeding. What was shocking becomes normal. What was taboo becomes tame. The escalation never stops. Meanwhile, real relationships suffer. How can an actual person, with flaws and complexity and emotional needs, compete with a carefully edited fantasy specifically designed to maximize arousal? They can't. And they shouldn't have to. Our culture sends profoundly mixed messages about lust. On one hand, we celebrate sexual liberation, sexual empowerment, sexual expression. Do whatever feels good. Express yourself. Don't be repressed. On the other hand, we're starting to grapple with the #MeToo movement, with the objectification of women, with the damage done by treating people as sexual objects. We want to be sexually liberated and also respected. We want to be desired and also valued for more than our bodies. We want to feed lust and also be loved for who we really are. But you can't have it both ways. Lust and love are fundamentally opposed. Lust uses, love gives. Lust consumes, love nurtures. Lust objectifies, love sees the whole person. The influencer in our story discovered this the hard way. You can build a following on lust, but you can't build real relationships on it. You can gain attention through sexual appeal, but you can't gain genuine love that way. Because people who gather around lust don't actually see you. They see what they want to see. They see what satisfies their desire. And when you stop providing that, they move on. Lust works closely with the other deadly sins. It's fueled by pride. I deserve this pleasure, I'm entitled to this gratification. It partners with greed, always wanting more, never satisfied with what you have. It can trigger envy, seeing what others have or who others have, and wanting it for yourself. And lust leads to other sins. Adultery, pornography, sexual exploitation, prostitution, human trafficking, these all flow from the root of lust, from treating people as objects to be used for sexual gratification. The early church father Augustine struggled profoundly with lust before his conversion. In his confessions he prayed, "Grant me chastity and continence, but not yet." He wanted to be free from lust, but he also wanted to enjoy it just a little bit longer. That's lust's trap. It feels good in the moment. The gratification is real, even if temporary. So we keep coming back, keep indulging, keep feeding the appetite, telling ourselves we'll stop eventually. Just not yet. But eventually never comes on its own. Lust doesn't release its grip voluntarily. It has to be actively resisted, actively fought, actively replaced with something better. The opposite of lust isn't repression or prudishness. It's purity, which doesn't mean the absence of sexual desire, but the proper ordering of it. Purity means seeing people as whole persons made in Yahweh's image, worthy of respect and dignity. It means training your eyes, your mind, your heart to appreciate beauty without objectifying, to experience attraction without reducing someone to their body. Purity means guarding what you look at, what you consume, what you allow into your mind. Because what you behold shapes who you become. Fill your mind with pornography, and you'll start seeing people as pornographic objects. Fill your mind with truth and beauty and goodness, and you'll start seeing people as Yahweh sees them. Purity means fleeing temptation, not testing your limits. Joseph, when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, didn't stay and try to resist. He ran. He literally fled the house. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is run away. Purity means finding your satisfaction in Yahweh rather than in sexual gratification. Remember Jesus' words to the woman at the well? The living water he offers actually satisfies. The temporary pleasure of lust never does. Lust hides in shadows. It thrives on secrecy. It tells you it's harmless, that everyone does it, that you're in control. But lust is a deadly sin because it kills relationships, kills intimacy, kills your ability to see and love real people. It promises fulfillment and delivers addiction. It promises connection and delivers isolation. It promises life and delivers death. The good news, and there is always good news, is that Yahweh offers freedom. Real freedom. Not the fake freedom of do whatever you want, but the genuine freedom of being what you were created to be. Freedom to see beauty without objectifying. Freedom to experience attraction without being controlled by it. Freedom to love people fully rather than use them partially. Freedom to be satisfied in Yahweh rather than endlessly chasing satisfaction in sexual gratification. That influencer, sitting in front of the camera, wrestling with who they are underneath the performance, there's hope for them. Hope for all of us who've let lust reduce us to something less than human. Because Yahweh sees you. Really sees you. Not as an object. Not as a performance. But as his beloved child, made in his image, worthy of love and respect and dignity. And he offers living water that actually, finally, truly satisfies. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from watching someone else succeed. Not the clean pain of disappointment in yourself, not the honest grief of loss, but something darker, more twisted. A pain that grows not from what you lack, but from what someone else has. That's envy. And it's one of the most corrosive of the deadly sins because it doesn't just damage your relationship with others, it destroys your relationship with yourself. Envy is sadness or resentment at another person's good. It's wanting what they have, or worse, wanting them not to have it. It's the perverse logic that says, if I can't be happy, no one should be. It's the belief that someone else's success is your failure, that their gain is your loss, that life is a zero-sum game and their piece of the pie means less for you. And here's what makes envy so insidious. It doesn't just poison your view of others. It erases who you were meant to be. Let me tell you a story about two artists, two friends, and how envy turned admiration into obsession and destroyed something beautiful in the process. They grew up together, these two. Same neighborhood, same art classes, same dreams of making it as painters. They were genuinely close, the kind of friendship where you finish each other's sentences, where you don't have to explain yourself because the other person just gets it. Both of them were talented. Both of them worked hard. Both of them had that fire, that drive, that absolute certainty that art was what they were meant to do with their lives. But success came to them differently. One of them, we'll call him Marcus, had a breakthrough early. A gallery owner happened to see his work at a local show. One thing led to another. A small exhibition. Positive reviews. Larger commissions. Within a few years, Marcus was making a living as an artist. Not rich, not famous exactly, but recognized. Respected. Selling work. Living the dream. The other, we'll call her Elena, struggled. Her work was good, genuinely good, but it just didn't connect the same way. The gallery owners were polite but non-committal. The exhibitions she managed to get into were poorly attended. The reviews, when they came, were lukewarm. Technically proficient but lacking a distinctive voice, one critic wrote. That line haunted her. And through it all, Elena genuinely tried to be happy for Marcus. She really did. She assisted in his studio, helped him prepare for shows, celebrated each breakthrough with authentic joy. Because she loved him. He was her friend. And she wanted good things for him. But somewhere, slowly, imperceptibly, admiration began to mutate into something else. It's hard to say exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the night of Marcus's first major gallery opening, when Elena stood in the corner watching collectors fawn over his paintings while her own portfolio sat unviewed in her bag. Maybe it was the magazine interview where Marcus was asked about his influences and he mentioned every artist except her, even though they'd learned together, grown together, pushed each other. Or maybe it was just the accumulation of 1,000 small moments. Watching him succeed while she struggled. Watching opportunities fall into his lap that she had to fight for and still didn't get. Watching the world recognize in him what she thought she had too, but somehow couldn't prove. The shift was subtle at first. A slight edge in her congratulations. A moment of hesitation before celebrating his wins. A quiet voice in her head whispering, "Why him and not me?" Then the voice got louder. "If he's that good, what does that make me? If he's succeeding and I'm not, doesn't that mean I'm worthless? Envy has this terrible logic. It turns someone else's success into evidence of your failure. It makes their accomplishments feel like a personal indictment. It whispers that there's only so much success to go around, and if they have it, you can't. Elena started comparing everything. Her brushwork to his. Her color choices to his. Her compositions to his. And always, she found herself lacking. Not because she actually was lacking. Her work was beautiful, distinctive, powerful in its own way. But envy blinds you to your own gifts. It makes you see everything through the lens of comparison, and in that comparison, you always lose. What started as painful awareness became obsession. Elena couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's success. She analyzed his paintings, trying to decode what made them work. She studied his technique, his style, his approach. She read every interview, watched every video, attended every show. She told herself she was learning. But really, she was disappearing. She started imitating his style. Just a little at first, a similar color palette, a comparable composition. I'm just exploring, she told herself. Artists influence each other all the time. But it went deeper. She started copying his mannerisms, the way he talked about art, the way he dressed. She rearranged her studio to look like his. She even changed her coffee order to match his because somehow, she convinced herself that everything about him held the secret to success, and if she could just replicate it all, she'd finally break through. Her own voice, the thing that critics said she lacked, was actually there all along. But she'd stopped listening to it. She'd stopped trusting it. She'd convinced herself that the only path to success was through becoming Marcus. Envy had erased Elena and replaced her with a shadow of someone else. Then came the opportunity that would reveal just how far she'd fallen. A prestigious gallery, one that had rejected her work twice before, reached out. They'd seen some of her recent paintings online and were interested in a solo exhibition. Elena couldn't believe it. Finally, recognition. Finally, success. She met with the curator, brought her portfolio, barely contained her excitement. The curator looked through her work with growing enthusiasm. This is exactly what we're looking for, she said. Such a bold new direction. Elena felt a thrill run through her. Thank you, I've been working really hard on developing this style. It's so different from Marcus Chen's earlier work, the curator continued. Same DNA, but evolved. More mature somehow. Elena's stomach dropped. I'm sorry, what? The curator looked confused. You are Marcus Chen, aren't you? Or working under his name? The style is so similar, and we'd heard he was exploring new techniques. And there it was. The gallery wasn't interested in Elena. They thought she was Marcus. They wanted him, and she looked enough like him that they'd made the mistake. She should have corrected them right there. Should have said, no, I'm Elena Rodriguez. This is my work, my style. But she didn't. Because in that moment, envy whispered a seductive lie. This is your chance. This is what you deserve. Take it. So she leaned into the confusion. Didn't confirm she was Marcus, didn't deny it either. Just let them assume, let them believe, let them move forward with the exhibition. The preparations were a blur. Elena, or whoever she was pretending to be now, worked frantically to create enough pieces for the show. She painted in Marcus's style, or what had become her bastardized version of it. Every brushstroke felt hollow, mechanical, but she pushed through. The opening night was everything she'd dreamed of. The gallery was packed. Critics came. Collectors came. People praised the work, called it innovative, talked about the evolution of Chen's vision. Elena stood in the crowd, accepting compliments for work that looked like someone else's, under a name that wasn't hers, feeling a validation that was completely fraudulent. And for a few hours, she had everything she thought she wanted. Applause. Attention. Recognition. People treating her like she mattered, like she was important, like she was successful. But it tasted like ashes. Because deep down she knew. This wasn't her success. This wasn't her voice. This wasn't even her identity anymore. Envy had so thoroughly consumed her that she'd literally erased herself and replaced herself with a cheap copy of someone else. Then Marcus walked in. He'd heard about the exhibition, news travels fast in the art world, and came to see what was going on. Elena saw him the moment he entered. Their eyes met across the gallery. He walked slowly through the exhibition, looking at each painting carefully. His face was unreadable. Other people in the gallery started whispering, recognizing him, confused about why the artist and his work were both present but separate. Finally, he approached her. The gallery went quiet. People were watching, sensing drama, pulling out phones. Elena braced herself for anger. For accusations. For the confrontation she deserved. But Marcus didn't look angry. He looked heartbroken. "Why?" he said quietly. "Just that." "Why?" Elena tried to explain. Tried to justify. I wanted what you have. I wanted people to see me the way they see you. You wanted my life instead of your own, Marcus said. And there was no malice in it, just profound sadness. Elena, I'm not angry that you imitated my style. I'm devastated that you abandoned yours. She started to protest, but he continued. I've seen your real work. The work you did before you started trying to be me. It was incredible. It had something I could never create, your perspective, your vision, your unique way of seeing the world. And you threw it away. For what? To be a second-rate version of me instead of a first-rate version of yourself. The words hit like physical blows. Because they were true. All of them true. The saddest part, Marcus said, is that you were never competing with me. You were on your own path. You had your own voice. And envy convinced you to abandon it. It didn't just poison our friendship. It erased who you were. The story ended, as these stories do, with consequences. The gallery, once they understood the deception, cancelled the exhibition. Elena's reputation in the art world was damaged, maybe irrevocably. Marcus, gracious to the end, didn't pursue legal action, but their friendship was over. How could it not be? But the real tragedy wasn't the cancelled exhibition or the lost friendship or the damaged reputation. The real tragedy was what Elena saw when she went back to her studio and looked at her old work, the paintings she'd made before envy took over. They were good. Really good. Distinctive, powerful, full of a voice that was entirely her own. And she'd abandoned that voice because she was so fixated on someone else's success that she couldn't see her own worth. Envy hadn't just made her resentful. It had made her into someone she wasn't. It had erased her identity and replaced it with a shadow. And now, looking at what she'd lost, she didn't even know if she could find her way back to who she used to be. This is what envy does, every time. It makes you measure your worth by someone else's success. It makes you believe that their gain is your loss. It turns every good thing that happens to someone else into evidence that good things won't happen to you. Envy is fundamentally irrational. Marcus's success didn't actually prevent Elena's. There wasn't a finite amount of artistic recognition in the world that Marcus had used up. Different people appreciate different styles. Different galleries want different voices. The art world is vast enough for both of them, for thousands of them, to succeed. But envy can't see that. Envy operates on the logic of scarcity even in the midst of abundance. It says, there's only one winner, and it's not you. And in believing that lie, in acting on that lie, Elena destroyed the very thing that could have brought her genuine success, her own unique voice, her own distinctive vision, her own irreplaceable perspective. Envy is ancient. It's literally the first sin recorded after the fall. Cain and Abel, the first brothers, the first murder. Both brought offerings to Yahweh. Abel's was accepted, Cain's was not. And instead of examining his own heart, instead of asking what he might learn from his brother, Cain let envy consume him. Why are you angry? Yahweh asked Cain. Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But Cain couldn't hear it. All he could see was that his brother had something he didn't, Yahweh's favor. All he could feel was the resentment, the bitterness, the poisonous thought that Abel's blessing somehow diminished him. So he killed him. He literally erased his brother because he couldn't stand the good that had come to him. That's envy's endpoint. If I can't be happy, no one should be. If I can't have it, neither should you. It's the fundamental rejection of love, which rejoices in another's good. Envy grieves at another's good and, given enough power, would destroy it entirely. King Saul and David, same story. David's success on the battlefield made Saul insanely jealous. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, the people sang. And that praise of David felt to Saul like condemnation of himself. Saul spent the rest of his reign trying to kill David, trying to destroy the very person who'd done nothing but serve him faithfully. Envy turned a potential friend into an enemy, a blessing into a curse, a helper into a threat. If envy was deadly in ancient times, it's absolutely toxic in the age of social media. We're constantly exposed to everyone else's highlight reels. Their successes, their achievements, their perfect-looking lives carefully curated and filtered. We see their vacations, their promotions, their relationships, their bodies, their talents, their possessions. And we compare. Constantly. Endlessly. We scroll through feeds that are literally designed to trigger envy. Look at what you don't have, look at what you're missing, look at how much better everyone else's life is than yours. And social media gives us metrics. Likes, followers, comments, shares. Quantifiable measures of worth and success and popularity. So we can precisely measure how we don't measure up. The research is clear. Increased social media use correlates with increased rates of depression, anxiety, and you guessed it, envy. We're poisoning ourselves with comparison, and the poison is always available, always accessible, always one click away. Elena's obsession with Marcus's success would be amplified 1,000-fold today. She wouldn't just hear about his exhibitions, she'd see every opening, every sale, every positive review, every collector praising his work, all documented in real time on Instagram. And she wouldn't just compare herself to Marcus. She'd compare herself to every artist on the planet, all of them showing only their best work, their biggest wins, their most flattering moments. But why is envy a deadly sin? Why is it capital foundational, a root from which other sins grow? Because envy is, at its core, a rejection of Yahweh's sovereignty and goodness. When you envy someone else's blessing, you're saying that Yahweh made a mistake in giving it to them instead of you. You're saying that his distribution of gifts, talents, opportunities, and blessings is unfair, unjust, wrong. You're making yourself the judge of what everyone should have, and you've decided that what Yahweh gave them should have been yours. It's pride disguised as victimhood. It's greed focused on what others have rather than what you lack. It's a fundamental distrust of Yahweh's goodness and his plan for your life. Proverbs 14 verse 30 says, "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." That's not just poetry, it's physiology. Envy literally makes you sick. It eats away at you from the inside. It rots your bones, your spirit, your soul. So what's the antidote to envy? How do we escape its grip? First, gratitude. Genuine, practiced, intentional gratitude for what you have instead of resentment for what others have. Not fake positivity, not toxic just be grateful dismissiveness of real struggles, but the discipline of noticing and naming the good in your own life. Second, celebrating others. This is countercultural and counterintuitive, but it's spiritually powerful. When someone else succeeds, practice saying, "I'm genuinely happy for them." And mean it. Choose to rejoice in their good rather than resenting it. This is what love does, by the way. 1 Corinthians 13 says love does not envy. Love celebrates when others are celebrated. Love rejoices when others rejoice. Love sees someone else's blessing and says, "Good. I'm so glad good things are happening to you." Third, focus on your own calling. Elena had her own voice, her own vision, her own path. She lost it because she was so focused on Marcus's path that she abandoned her own. You have gifts that others don't have. You have a calling that is uniquely yours. You have a role to play in Yahweh's kingdom that no one else can fill. Stop comparing your chapter 3 to someone else's chapter 20. Run your own race. Paint your own paintings. Sing your own songs. Fourth, remember that this life isn't the full story. In eternity, there will be no envy because there will be no scarcity. Everyone will have fullness of joy. Everyone will be perfectly fulfilled in Yahweh's presence. No one will lack anything. The race we're running isn't against each other. It's toward the finish line where we all win, where we all receive the prize, where we all hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Envy hides behind rationalization. I'm just noticing inequality. I'm just being realistic about unfairness. They don't deserve what they have. But underneath all of that is the simple poisonous truth. You're resentful that they have good and you don't. You're sad at their blessing. And given the chance, you take it from them. That's envy. And it will destroy you if you let it. It will erase who you are, just like it erased Elena. It will make you abandon your own voice in pursuit of someone else's. It will turn blessings into curses, friends into enemies, and life into a zero-sum competition that you can never win. But here's the hope: Yahweh sees you. Really sees you. Not in comparison to anyone else, but as yourself, as his beloved child, as someone he created with purpose and gifts and a unique role to play. And he has good things for you. Not the same good things he has for everyone else, but good things suited specifically to you, to your calling, to your journey. You don't need to be anyone else. You don't need to have what anyone else has. You need to be fully yourself, the person Yahweh created you to be, running the race he set before you, using the gifts he gave you, fulfilling the calling he placed on your life. And when you do that, when you stop comparing and start creating, when you stop envying and start living, you'll find something better than what you envied in others. You'll find yourself. Of all the 7 deadly sins, gluttony might be the one we take least seriously. Pride sounds dramatic. Lust sounds dangerous. Wrath sounds violent. But gluttony? That just sounds like someone who likes dessert a little too much. We make jokes about it. We celebrate it, even. Food culture has never been bigger. Cooking shows, food Instagram, elaborate mukbangs where people film themselves eating enormous quantities of food. We live in a culture of abundance, where having more than enough is the norm, where indulgence is marketed as self-care, where treat yourself is a command we follow without question. But gluttony, real gluttony, the deadly sin, is about more than overeating. It's about overindulgence, about going beyond what is needed for nourishment or health, about an unhealthy relationship with consumption itself. And it reveals something deeper about us: our inability to accept limits, our refusal to practice restraint, our desperate attempt to fill spiritual emptiness with physical excess. Let me tell you a story about a city that solved hunger and in doing so, discovered something far worse. Imagine a futuristic city, gleaming towers, advanced technology, brilliant minds working to solve humanity's oldest problem, hunger. For thousands of years, humans had struggled with scarcity. Not enough food. Unequal distribution. People going hungry while others had plenty. But this city cracked it. They developed smart snacks, small portions of food, perfectly nutritionally balanced, dispensed on every street corner from sleek machines. The technology was revolutionary. The snacks adapted to your taste buds, giving you exactly what you craved at any given moment. Wanted something sweet? The snack tasted like the perfect dessert. Wanted something savory? It delivered exactly that flavor profile. And it was free. Universal. Accessible to everyone at any time. The city celebrated. Press conferences announced the end of food scarcity. No more hunger, the mayor proclaimed. No more long meal preparations. No more waiting. Food whenever you want it, however you want it, perfectly calibrated to your needs and preferences. Scientists explained how it worked. The snacks read your biological markers, understood your nutritional deficits, delivered exactly what your body required. You couldn't get fat from them. They adjusted portions automatically. You couldn't get malnourished. They ensured perfect nutritional balance. It seemed utopian. A genuine solution to a genuine problem. Who could argue with eliminating hunger? At first, people still ate meals together. Old habits die hard. Families would gather for dinner, even if they weren't particularly hungry, just to maintain tradition, to connect, to share. But gradually, that changed. Why sit down for a meal when you could grab a perfectly satisfying snack while you worked? Why take a lunch break when you could eat exactly what you craved without interrupting your productivity? Why plan family dinners when everyone could eat on their own schedule, perfectly satisfied by their personalized snacks? The shift happened slowly. Restaurants closed first. Why pay for food when it was free on every corner? Then grocery stores. Then kitchens became obsolete. Spaces converted to other uses since no one cooked anymore. Eating became a constant, background activity. Like breathing. Like blinking. People grazed all day, every day. Grab a snack while walking to work. Another during a meeting. One more while watching entertainment. Again before bed. There was no hunger to signal eating time. No fullness to signal stopping time. Just a constant, low-level consumption. An endless snacking that required no thought, no planning, no discipline. The The city had eliminated the pain of hunger. But in doing so, it had also eliminated the pleasure of satisfaction. Old-timers in the city noticed what was disappearing. The festivals that had been built around shared meals, harvest celebrations, religious feasts, cultural gatherings centered on food, they all vanished. What's the point of a feast when you're never hungry? What's the point of celebration when you're constantly, mildly satisfied? A grandmother tried to host a traditional family dinner. She spent hours preparing dishes the old-fashioned way, from actual ingredients she'd special ordered at great expense. She set the table beautifully. She invited her children and grandchildren. They showed up out of obligation, but none of them were hungry. They'd been snacking all day, as usual. They picked at the food politely, but couldn't really enjoy it. Their taste buds had been so constantly stimulated that nothing tasted special anymore. "I don't understand," the grandmother said, near tears. "When I was young, we'd wait all year for this meal. We'd look forward to it. We'd come hungry and leave satisfied. It meant something." Her granddaughter patted her hand kindly. "That was when you had to wait, Grandma. When you didn't have choices. We're lucky now. We never have to be hungry. We never have to wait." But the grandmother wondered, was that really luck? Or had they lost something precious in the bargain? Because meals had never been just about nutrition. They'd been about rhythm, breakfast, lunch, dinner marking the day. They'd been about community, gathering, sharing, connecting. They'd been about gratitude, stopping to give thanks for provision. They'd been about discipline, learning to wait, to delay gratification, to experience hunger and then satisfaction. All of that was gone, replaced by an endless, mindless grazing that required nothing and meant nothing. Then the doctors noticed something strange. Despite perfect nutritional profiles, every citizen getting exactly what their body needed, every marker optimized, every deficiency corrected, people were getting weaker. More listless. Less energetic. It didn't make sense. Medically, everyone was perfectly nourished. But functionally, everyone was diminished. They were never truly hungry. But never fully satisfied either. Just constantly, mildly consuming, in a state of perpetual semi-satiation that left them in a kind of nutritional limbo. The body, doctors discovered, needed rhythm. Needed periods of hunger followed by periods of fullness. Needed fasting and feasting. The constant grazing, even with perfect nutrition, was actually harmful. But more than that, and this is what the doctors struggled to quantify, people seemed spiritually diminished. Less joyful. Less engaged. Moving through life in a kind of fog, constantly consuming but never quite alive. One doctor put it this way: we've given them everything their bodies need and nothing their souls need. We've optimized nutrition and killed meaning. An elder in the city, one of the last people who remembered life before the smart snacks, gave a speech that went viral. He stood in the city square and spoke. "We haven't just lost moderation. We've lost occasions. We've lost the moments where we stop, where we gather, where we give thanks, where we share. I remember being hungry, really hungry, and then sitting down to a meal and feeling that first bite, that satisfaction, that deep contentment. I remember saying grace, acknowledging that this food was a gift, not a right. I remember tasting things, really tasting them, because I'd waited, because I was ready, because the moment mattered. Now we eat constantly and taste nothing. We consume endlessly and enjoy nothing. We've eliminated hunger, but we've also eliminated satisfaction. And in the space between, we've lost something human. Gluttony isn't just overeating. It's the refusal to accept limits or rhythm. It's turning eating into a perpetual numbing drip instead of distinct, meaningful moments. We conquered famine, but we starved ourselves of meaning. The speech resonated because people felt it, even if they couldn't articulate it. Something was missing. Something important. Something that all the perfect nutrition in the world couldn't replace. See, the city's problem wasn't that they had solved hunger. It's that they'd eliminated all the spiritual and communal dimensions of eating in the process. They'd reduced food to pure utility, nutrients in, energy out, and lost everything else that made eating human. This is what gluttony always does. It takes something good that Yahweh created, food, the pleasure of eating, the satisfaction of hunger being met, and distorts it. Overuses it. Makes it an end in itself rather than a means to an end. The city did this collectively. But we do it individually all the time. We eat when we're not hungry because we're bored, stressed, anxious, sad. We use food to numb emotions instead of experiencing them. We consume mindlessly, scrolling through phones while eating, not even tasting the food, just shoveling it in. We've turned eating into a constant background activity instead of a distinct, meaningful practice. Snacking all day, grazing mindlessly, never quite hungry, never quite satisfied, just constantly consuming. And it's not just about food, is it? We do this with everything. Constant entertainment consumption, endless scrolling, perpetual stimulation. We've eliminated boredom but also eliminated rest. We've filled every moment but lost the rhythm of life. The Bible has a lot to say about food and eating, and it's more nuanced than we might expect. Food is good. Yahweh created it. Jesus' first miracle was providing wine at a wedding feast. The kingdom of heaven is described as a banquet. Food and feasting are celebrated throughout Scripture. But so is fasting. So is discipline. So is restraint. Proverbs 23 warns, "Do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat, for drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags." It's not about the food being evil. It's about the lack of self-control, the overindulgence, the prioritizing of physical pleasure over everything else. In the wilderness, Yahweh gave the Israelites manna, exactly enough for each day. Those who tried to hoard it, to gather more than they needed, found that it rotted overnight. The lesson? Trust Yahweh for daily provision. Accept the limits. Don't grasp for more than you need. Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his ministry. When Satan tempted him to turn stones into bread, Jesus replied, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." The point wasn't that bread is bad. The point is that we need more than bread. We need spiritual sustenance. We need Yahweh's word. We need meaning beyond mere consumption. And when we try to satisfy spiritual hunger with physical food, or physical anything, we end up like that city, constantly consuming, never satisfied, diminished rather than fulfilled. Paul wrote to the Philippians about people whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, with minds set on earthly things. Their God is their belly. That's gluttony elevated to idolatry. When physical appetite becomes the thing you serve, the thing you organize your life around, the thing you can't resist, it's become your God. And Paul's point is that this is shameful. Not because there's shame in having a body or in enjoying food, but because we were made for something higher. We were made to be mastered by the Spirit, not by our appetites. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul says, "Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, but God will destroy both one and the other." The body is not meant for sexual immorality but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. He's addressing people who were saying, "My body has appetites, and I should satisfy them. That's just natural." And Paul's response is, yes, you have appetites, but you're not enslaved to them. You're made for something more than satisfying every desire the moment you feel it. Here's what the city discovered, what we all discover eventually: we can't eat our way to satisfaction. Not really. Not in any lasting sense. Because the deepest hungers we have aren't physical. They're spiritual. We're hungry for meaning, for purpose, for connection, for love, for transcendence, for Yahweh. And we try to fill those spiritual hungers with physical food, or physical anything. More consumption, more stimulation, more indulgence. Thinking that if we just get enough, consume enough, experience enough, we'll finally feel full. But it doesn't work. It can't work. You can't satisfy a spiritual hunger with physical food any more than you can quench physical thirst with a beautiful sunset. Different categories, different needs. Jesus said to the woman at the well, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again." He was talking about spiritual sustenance, about the living water that actually satisfies the deepest thirst, about finding fullness in him rather than in endless consumption. The city's smart snacks could deliver perfect nutrition, but they couldn't deliver meaning. They couldn't create community. They couldn't inspire gratitude. They couldn't satisfy the soul. Only Yahweh can do that. Like all the deadly sins, gluttony doesn't exist in isolation. It partners with the others. It's fueled by greed, always wanting more, never having enough. It's connected to sloth, the easier path of immediate gratification rather than the discipline of restraint. It can feed envy, looking at what others are consuming and wanting the same. It serves pride, I deserve this indulgence, I've earned it, I can do what I want. And gluttony creates other sins. Waste, injustice, overconsumption in one place while others starve. Health problems that limit your ability to serve. Financial problems from overspending on consumption. Relationship problems when appetite becomes more important than people. The early church fathers saw gluttony as particularly insidious because it seemed so innocent. It's just food, right? Everyone has to eat. What's the harm in enjoying it a little too much? But they understood that how we handle small appetites reveals how we'll handle larger ones. If we can't control our relationship with food, something we encounter multiple times every day, how will we control our relationship with money, sex, power, anything else? Discipline in the small things builds capacity for discipline in the large things. Lack of restraint in the small things reveals a fundamental problem with self-control that will manifest everywhere. The opposite of gluttony is temperance, sometimes called moderation or self-control. It's not about never enjoying food or drink. It's about proper relationship with physical pleasures. Temperance means eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're satisfied. It means enjoying food without being controlled by it. It means being able to fast, to choose not to eat even when you could, because you recognize that your body doesn't rule you. It means creating rhythm, times of fasting and times of feasting, times of restraint and times of celebration, times of hunger and times of satisfaction. The early Christians practiced fasting regularly, not to earn salvation, grace can't be earned, but to train their appetites, to remind themselves that man does not live by bread alone, to create space for spiritual hunger to be recognized and addressed. Many still practice this. Fasting during Lent, skipping meals to pray, choosing hunger as a spiritual discipline. And the paradox is, when you learn to fast, feasting becomes more meaningful. When you allow yourself to be truly hungry, satisfaction becomes deeper. When you practice restraint, celebration becomes sweeter. The city had eliminated hunger and in doing so, eliminated true satisfaction. They'd made eating constant and therefore meaningless. But when you have rhythm, when you have limits, when you have discipline, meals become occasions again. Eating becomes mindful again. Food becomes something to be grateful for rather than something to mindlessly consume. We live in the city. Maybe not literally, but functionally. We have unprecedented access to food. We can order anything we want, any time of day, delivered to our door. We have infinite variety. We have constant availability. And we're more gluttonous than ever. Not just with food, but with everything. Binge-watching entire seasons in one sitting. Endless scrolling through social media. Constant consumption of news, entertainment, stimulation. We've eliminated boredom but also eliminated rest, contemplation, silence. We're perpetually consuming but never satisfied. Always hungry for the next thing but never taking time to enjoy what we have. Living in a state of constant low-level overconsumption that leaves us bloated and empty at the same time. And our physical health shows it. Obesity rates have never been higher. Diabetes, heart disease, all the consequences of overconsumption are epidemic. But our spiritual health is even worse. We're starving for meaning while gorging on entertainment. We're desperate for connection while numbing ourselves with consumption. We're longing for transcendence while drowning in trivia. Gluttony seems innocent. It seems like such a small thing. Just another snack. Just another episode. Just another purchase. Just another click. But those small choices, repeated constantly, shape who we become. They train our appetites. They form our character. They reveal what we worship. The city learned too late that conquering hunger wasn't the same as cultivating satisfaction. That eliminating limits wasn't the same as achieving freedom. That constant consumption wasn't the same as true nourishment. But we can learn from their mistake. We can choose rhythm over constant consumption. We can choose discipline over indulgence. We can choose to be satisfied with enough instead of always craving more. We can recognize that our deepest hunger isn't for food but for Yahweh. And we can come to Him, the bread of life, and finally, be satisfied. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." That's the promise. That's the hope. That's the satisfaction that all our consumption has been failing to achieve. Not in constant snacking. Not in endless grazing. But in coming to Him, stopping, receiving, and being truly, deeply, finally satisfied. There's something intoxicating about anger. That surge of adrenaline when you've been wronged. That feeling of righteous power when you unleash your rage. That momentary satisfaction when you destroy someone with your words, when you make them feel small, when you punish them for what they did to you. Anger isn't always wrong. Yahweh gets angry, at injustice, at oppression, at sin. Jesus got angry, at the money changers defiling the temple, at religious leaders burdening people with rules while missing the heart of the law. There is such a thing as righteous anger, holy indignation at genuine evil. But wrath is something different. Wrath is anger that has lost all proportion, all control, all connection to justice. Wrath is rage that feeds on itself, that grows with expression rather than being satisfied by it. Wrath is anger that becomes an identity, an atmosphere, a constant state of being. Wrath destroys. It destroys relationships. It destroys communities. It destroys the person who harbors it. And in our age of social media, where rage is algorithmically amplified and anonymously expressed, wrath has found the perfect breeding ground. Let me tell you a story about a small town that learned this the hard way. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors waved as they drove by, where community actually meant something. The kind of place that still had town meetings where people debated local issues face to face. But keeping up with community news was getting harder. Not everyone could make it to meetings. Important announcements were getting missed. So someone had what seemed like a brilliant idea: create an online forum. A digital town square where people could stay informed, ask questions, discuss issues. It launched with genuine optimism. The mayor posted announcements. The school board shared updates. People asked about road closures and recommended local contractors. There were disagreements, sure. Should the library expand? Was the new stop sign necessary? But they were civil, respectful. The kind of healthy debate that makes democracy work. People who knew each other offline were kind to each other online. They assumed good intent. They gave each other grace. After all, these were their neighbors. For a few months, it worked beautifully. The forum became the heartbeat of the community, connecting people, informing people, helping people. And then came the building project. A developer proposed a mixed-use development on the edge of town. Apartments, shops, a small park. Some people thought it was exactly what the town needed: growth, tax revenue, new businesses. Others thought it would ruin the town's character: too much traffic, wrong kind of development, changing what made the town special. It was a legitimate disagreement. Reasonable people could, and did, disagree. The first forum posts about it were thoughtful. People laid out their positions, cited reasons, asked questions. There was back and forth, but it was substantive. Then someone made it personal. Anyone who supports this clearly doesn't care about our children's safety with all this traffic. It was a small thing. Just one sentence. But it crossed a line, from disagreeing with a position to impugning someone's character. From "I think you're wrong" to "you're a bad person." The response was swift. "How dare you question my concern for children? I have 3 kids. Do you? Maybe if you actually cared about the town's future instead of living in the past." And suddenly, it wasn't about the building anymore. It was personal. It was emotional. It was angry. What happened next revealed something dark about human nature, something the algorithm was specifically designed to exploit. People discovered how gratifying it felt to unleash unfiltered rage. In person, social pressure kept most people civil. You wouldn't scream at your neighbor in the grocery store. You wouldn't call them an idiot at the town meeting. Face to face, we moderate ourselves, we hold back, we remember that we're talking to an actual human being we'll see again. But online? Especially with partial anonymity, just usernames, no faces, no immediate consequences, people could say what they really felt. Could unleash the anger they'd normally suppress. Could insult, attack, eviscerate without seeing the hurt in someone's eyes. And it felt powerful. It felt righteous. It felt good. The forum had a like system and a comment counter. And people quickly noticed, the angriest posts got the most engagement. A thoughtful, nuanced comment might get 2 or 3 likes. But a scathing insult, a devastating takedown, a vicious personal attack? Dozens of likes. Hundreds of comments. People piling on, adding their own outrage, feeding the fire. The algorithm, designed to promote engaging content, started boosting the angriest posts to the top. Not the most informative. Not the most thoughtful. The angriest. Because anger is engaging. Anger gets attention. Anger makes people react. And reactions are what algorithms reward. Within months, the tone of the entire forum had changed. Conversations that used to be civil became battlegrounds. People who had been friendly offline became enemies online. The building project debate had long since ceased to be about the actual merits of development. It had become tribal. You were either with us or against us. Team progress or team tradition. And the other team wasn't just wrong, they were evil, stupid, corrupt, destroying everything good about the town. People arrived at actual town meetings already primed for battle by nightly online flare-ups. They'd spent hours reading enraged posts about the other side, seeing the worst interpretations of their opponents' positions, working themselves into a state of moral outrage. So when they showed up in person, they weren't coming to discuss. They were coming to fight. The meetings became hostile. People shouted. They interrupted. They refused to listen. The mayor had to start implementing strict time limits and rules just to maintain basic order. And then the meetings became fodder for more online outrage. Someone would record a snippet, post it to the forum with an inflammatory caption, and the cycle would continue. Look at how unreasonable they are. Can you believe what they said? This is what we're dealing with. With everyone primed for outrage, rumors spread faster than corrections. Someone would post something partially true, or misinterpreted, or completely fabricated, and it would go viral on the forum before anyone could fact-check it. I heard they're planning to cut down the oak trees for parking. Someone told me the developer donated to the mayor's campaign. Did you see that the opposition hired outside protesters? None of it was verified. Most of it was false or wildly exaggerated. But it didn't matter. Wrath doesn't care about truth. Wrath just wants fuel for the fire. And when someone tried to correct a false rumor, they were attacked. You're just trying to cover for them. Why are you defending them unless you're part of it? Typical, always making excuses for your side. Truth became tribal. Facts became partisan. Reality itself was up for debate, determined not by evidence but by which team you were on. The worst moment came when it turned on an individual. A high school teacher made an offhand comment during a class discussion about the development. Something like, "We need to consider multiple perspectives on this." A student screen captured a text exchange where someone had quoted the teacher, third hand, out of context, misremembered. Posted it to the forum with the caption, "This is what they're teaching our kids." Within hours, the teacher was the target of a massive outrage cycle. People who had never met them, who had no idea what was actually said, who hadn't bothered to verify the quote, they all had opinions. Strong opinions. Angry opinions. This teacher needs to be fired. They're indoctrinating our children. How is this person allowed in a classroom? The thread went on for days. Hundreds of comments. Most of them vicious. People made memes. They dug up the teacher's old social media posts, looking for more evidence of whatever they'd already decided was true. They called the school demanding action. The teacher's students watched this happen. Watched adults, people they'd been taught to respect, community members who were supposed to model maturity, reduce a real person, someone who had taught them, cared for them, invested in them, into a caricature. A villain. A two-dimensional target for their rage. The teacher, for the record, had said nothing controversial. Had simply encouraged students to think critically about different viewpoints. But that didn't matter. Wrath had found a target, and wrath doesn't stop until it destroys. The town split into factions that no longer spoke to each other offline. You could tell who was on which team by who they associated with, who they waved at, who they avoided. Friendships ended. Church congregations fractured. Sports teams became uncomfortable as parents on opposite sides tried to maintain civility at games while waging war online. And here's the tragic irony. Most people didn't even care that much about the actual building project anymore. The development had become a proxy for deeper divisions, deeper resentments, deeper anger that had nothing to do with mixed-use zoning. People were addicted to the outrage. They checked the forum constantly, first thing in the morning, last thing at night, during work, during dinner. They couldn't stop. The anger had become an identity they clung to, a community they belonged to, a purpose that gave their lives meaning. Wrath, once a passing emotion triggered by a specific offense, had become a constant atmosphere, a way of being, a filter through which they saw everything. They were angry when they woke up, angry throughout the day, angry when they went to bed. And they couldn't even remember why anymore. The original issue had been lost in layers upon layers of secondary conflicts, personal attacks, and manufactured outrage. Then a major storm hit, knocked out power across the region, took down cell towers. The internet went dark. For the first couple days, people were just focused on practical concerns, checking on elderly neighbors, sharing generators, making sure everyone had food and water. And something strange happened. Without the constant feed of outrage, without the algorithm amplifying anger, without the anonymous screen to hide behind, people started acting like neighbors again. They awkwardly ran into each other at the one grocery store with backup power. They stood in the same checkout lines. They helped each other carry supplies to cars. And they realized something uncomfortable. The monsters they'd been fighting online were just people. Flawed humans holding the same carts and buying the same bread. People who were tired and worried about their food spoiling and grateful that the pharmacy still had their medication. The teacher showed up at the community center where they were distributing emergency supplies. The person who'd posted that inflammatory screenshot about them was there too, volunteering. They made eye contact. The person looked away, ashamed. Because it's easy to destroy someone online, when they're just words on a screen, when you don't have to see their face, when you can imagine them as whatever villain you need them to be. It's a lot harder when they're standing right in front of you, in line for bottled water, just a person. A real, complicated, human person who's doing their best, just like you. The power came back after several days. The internet reconnected. The forum loaded. Everyone faced a choice. They could log back in as the people they truly were, the neighbors who had helped each other during the storm, who had remembered that they were part of the same community, who had rediscovered basic human decency offline. Or they could log in as the avatars of their rage, the warriors, the fighters, the outraged identities they'd constructed online, ready to continue the battle, to feed the anger, to sustain the wrath that had consumed them. The story ends with that question unanswered. Because we all face that question, every time we log on. Every time we encounter someone we disagree with. Every time we feel that surge of anger. Will we be who we truly are? Or will we become avatars of our rage? This story illustrates what wrath always does. It takes legitimate anger, and sometimes the initial anger is completely justified, and perverts it into something destructive. Wrath feeds on itself. Unlike other emotions that exhaust themselves, you can only be sad for so long before you need a break. Wrath actually grows with expression. The more you rage, the more enraged you become. The more you attack, the more you want to attack. It's an addiction. Wrath dehumanizes. It turns people into caricatures, into representatives of ideas you hate, into acceptable targets for your aggression. The teacher wasn't a person anymore. They were the enemy, the problem, what's wrong with education today. Wrath destroys nuance. Everything becomes black and white. You're either with us or against us. There's no room for complexity, for both / and for I see your point but disagree. It's all or nothing, total war. Wrath creates cycles of retaliation. They attacked us, so we attack them, so they attack us back, so we attack harder. Each side convinced they're just defending themselves, just responding to aggression, never acknowledging their own role in perpetuating the cycle. And wrath destroys the person who harbors it. Medical research shows that chronic anger is terrible for your health: higher blood pressure, increased risk of heart disease, compromised immune function. But the spiritual damage is even worse. Wrath makes you bitter, suspicious, unable to enjoy life because you're constantly focused on what's wrong, who's to blame, what outrage to be consumed by next. The Bible has a lot to say about anger and wrath, and it's more nuanced than simple prohibition. Ephesians 4 verse 26 says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger." Notice, Be angry. Anger itself isn't sin. But don't let it become sin. Don't let it fester overnight. Don't let it take root and grow into something toxic. James 1 verses 19 to 20 advises, "Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Slow to anger. Not never angry, but slow, controlled, thoughtful. Because human anger, uncontrolled, unchecked, self-righteous, doesn't accomplish Yahweh's purposes. It just destroys. Proverbs is full of wisdom about anger. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. 15:18. Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. 29:11. A person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. 19:11. Over and over, control your anger. Don't let it control you. Practice patience. Overlook offenses. Seek peace. Because wrath, uncontrolled, indulged, fed, becomes a fire that consumes everything. So how do we distinguish between righteous anger and deadly wrath? Righteous anger is focused on injustice, not personal offense. Jesus was angry at the money changers because they were exploiting the poor and profaning the temple, not because they'd personally insulted him. Righteous anger is proportional. It matches the offense. Wrath is disproportionate. A minor slight becomes grounds for total war. Righteous anger seeks justice and reconciliation. It wants things made right. Wrath just wants to punish, to hurt, to destroy. Righteous anger can coexist with love. Jesus was angry at the Pharisees and still died for them. Wrath and love are incompatible. Righteous anger is temporary, triggered by specific wrongs. Wrath is chronic, a constant state, an identity. And here's the key test: righteous anger makes you uncomfortable. You don't enjoy it. You don't seek it out. It's a response to real evil that grieves you even as it angers you. Wrath feels good. It's intoxicating. You seek opportunities for it. You scroll looking for things to be outraged about. You enjoy the feeling of moral superiority, of righteous indignation, of unleashing your rage on acceptable targets. If you're enjoying your anger, it's probably wrath, not righteousness. Social media has weaponized wrath. Every platform is designed to amplify outrage because outrage drives engagement, and engagement drives profit. The algorithms promote the angriest content. The like buttons reward the most savage takedowns. The share functions spread outrage faster than anything else. And the anonymity, or even just the distance, the screen between you and the target, removes the normal social constraints that keep anger in check. Studies show that people say things online they would never say face-to-face. The same person who is polite at the grocery store becomes a vicious warrior in the comment section. And we've normalized it. We celebrate it, even. We give platforms to people whose whole brand is outrage. We reward influencers who are constantly angry about something. We share the most inflammatory takes because they're so true, or this needed to be said. We're the town in the story, all of us. We've created digital forums where wrath is not just permitted but encouraged, where being constantly outraged is treated as a virtue, where the angriest voice wins. And we're discovering the same thing that town discovered: wrath destroys community. It destroys relationships. It destroys our humanity. The opposite of wrath isn't passivity or indifference. It's patience, self-control, and peace. It's learning to be slow to anger, to pause before reacting, to take a breath, to ask, is this proportional? Is this necessary? Is this helpful? It's choosing to overlook offenses. Not every slight needs a response. Not every disagreement needs to be a battle. It's practicing empathy, remembering that the person on the other side of the screen is an actual human being, with their own struggles, their own pain, their own complicated story. It's seeking peace, not peace at any cost, not pretending problems don't exist, but genuine reconciliation where possible, de-escalation instead of escalation. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Not peacekeepers, people who just avoid conflict. Peacemakers, people who actively work to create peace, to bridge divides, to heal what's broken. And he said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Not ignore your enemies. Not be indifferent to persecution. Love them. Pray for them. That's the antidote to wrath. Not denial of wrong, but love anyway. Not pretending everything's fine, but refusing to let anger consume you. Wrath promises power, but delivers bondage. It promises righteousness, but delivers bitterness. It promises victory, but destroys everything it touches, including you. But there's another way. The way of peace. The way of patience. The way of love that covers a multitude of sins. It's not easy. It's not natural. It requires supernatural grace to love enemies, to bless those who curse you, to respond to anger with patience. But it's the way of Jesus. And it's the only way that actually heals, actually restores, actually brings life instead of death. The power's back on. The forum's loaded. The choice is yours. Who will you log in as? When most people hear sloth, they picture someone lying on a couch, too lazy to move, eating chips and watching television. And sure, physical laziness can be part of it. But the deadly sin of sloth, what the early church called aestia, is something far more subtle and far more dangerous than just being lazy. Sloth is spiritual apathy. It's moral indifference. It's the refusal to do good or pursue the things of Yahweh, not because you're actively rejecting them, but because you just can't be bothered. You don't care enough. It's too much effort. Why bother? If wrath is too much fire, sloth is no fire at all. It's the cold ashes of a heart that has stopped burning for anything. It's the slow death of curiosity, of passion, of care. It's checking out, tuning out, numbing out, not because life is meaningless, but because engaging with meaning requires effort, and effort feels like too much to ask. And in our age of endless shortcuts, instant gratification, and predigested content, sloth has never been easier to fall into or harder to recognize. Let me tell you a story about someone who lost their soul one shortcut at a time. There was a student, brilliant, curious, passionate. The kind of person who devoured books, who stayed up late chasing footnotes, who couldn't resist following a reference to its source just to see what the original author had actually said. They didn't just read for class. They read for joy, for understanding, for that electric thrill when a new idea clicks into place, when you suddenly see something you've never seen before, when the world rearranges itself around a single profound insight. They argued with professors, not to be difficult, but because they cared enough to push back, to question, to test ideas against reality. They spent nights in the library not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because learning was alive for them. Because knowledge mattered. Their papers were original, thoughtful, deeply researched. They wrestled with difficult texts, sat with complexity, refused to settle for easy answers. Reading a challenging philosopher meant actually reading them, slowly, carefully, multiple times if necessary, until they really understood. This was someone on fire. Someone fully engaged. Someone alive to the life of the mind. And then gradually, imperceptibly, the fire went out. It started innocently enough. Life got busier. More classes, more responsibilities, more demands on their time. And technology offered solutions. Why spend 3 hours reading a dense academic article when you could get an auto-digest that summarized the key points in 3 minutes? Why struggle through a difficult book when there were YouTube videos explaining it simply? Why chase down primary sources when there were curated best of collections that gave you everything you needed to know? At first, these tools genuinely helped. They were supplementary, not replacement. A way to triage reading, to figure out what deserved deep attention and what could be skimmed. But gradually, so gradually they didn't even notice, the shortcuts became the main thing. The summaries replaced the sources. The digests replaced the documents. The explanations replaced the actual engagement. They stopped reading the originals at all. Why would they? The summary hit the key points. The abstract covered the main argument. The book review told them what to think about it. They could get an A on the paper without ever really engaging with the material. And they did get A's. They still turned in papers. Still participated in discussions. Still looked like a successful student from the outside. But something subtle had died. Something precious. Something they didn't even realize they'd lost until it was too late to easily get it back. The first thing that died was their questions. They used to have so many questions. Why did the author choose this word instead of that one? What happens if you take this premise to its logical conclusion? How does this connect to that other idea we read about last month? Questions born of genuine curiosity. Questions that couldn't be answered by a summary because they went deeper than the surface, required original thinking, demanded engagement with the actual text. But when you only read summaries, you only get answers. Predigested answers to questions someone else thought were important. You don't develop your own questions because you never spend enough time with the material for questions to arise naturally. Their questions became shallower. What's the main point? What do I need to know for the test? What's the professor looking for? Strategic questions. Utilitarian questions. Questions designed to get through the material, not to understand it. Questions that treated learning as an obstacle to overcome rather than a treasure to discover. And they stopped being genuinely excited by ideas. They couldn't remember the last time they'd stayed up late because a concept fascinated them, the last time they'd gotten into a heated discussion because they cared about what was true, the last time they'd felt that electric thrill of real understanding. Learning had become a transaction. Input minimum effort, output acceptable grades. No joy, no wonder, no life. The crisis came unexpectedly. A younger student, still on fire, still curious, approached them after class. "I'm thinking about majoring in this field," the student said, eyes bright with excitement. "You're so far along. Why did you choose it? What made you fall in love with it?" And they opened their mouth to answer and realized they couldn't remember. They could recite facts. They could explain the career prospects. They could list the practical reasons. But they couldn't recall the last time they'd been genuinely excited by a new idea instead of just getting through the material. When had learning stopped being about falling in love with ideas and started being about checking boxes? When had they stopped caring? The question haunted them. But not enough to change anything. Not yet. Because changing would require effort, and effort was exactly what they'd been systematizing out of their life. Then came the assignment that couldn't be shortcut, a complex ethical case study. A real-world situation with no clear right answer, requiring them to grapple with competing values, to think deeply about principles and their applications, to make a judgment and defend it. They reached for their usual tools. Searched for similar cases. Found think pieces with pre-formed opinions. Located academic papers with ethical frameworks already applied. And they felt it, that familiar relief of having a shortcut, of not having to do the hard work themselves. But this time, something else came with the relief. Discomfort. A small voice that said, "This is a betrayal." A betrayal of what? Of whom? Of their own mind. Of their own capacity for thought. Of their own responsibility to engage with difficult questions instead of outsourcing them to whoever had written about it first. For the first time in years, the shortcut felt wrong. Not inefficient, wrong. Morally wrong. Spiritually wrong. Because this was an ethical question that would affect real people. And they were treating it like just another assignment to get through, just another task to optimize, just another problem to solve with minimal effort. They were refusing to engage deeply with what is good, true, and beautiful. Refusing to do the work their mind was capable of doing. Refusing to care enough to wrestle with complexity. And that refusal, that sloth. That's aestia. That's the deadly sin. In that moment of discomfort, they made a decision. A small decision, really, but countercultural in its defiance of everything their life had become. They would sit with one difficult book. Slowly. With no shortcuts at all. Not a summary. Not a video explanation. Not SparkNotes or CliffsNotes or AI-generated abstracts. Just them and the book and the hard work of actually reading, actually thinking, actually engaging. It was harder than they remembered. So much harder. Their attention wandered constantly. They kept reaching for their phone for distractions, for relief from the effort of sustained concentration. The prose was dense. The arguments were complex. They had to reread paragraphs multiple times to understand them. There were no bullet points, no key takeaways conveniently highlighted. Just the slow, patient work of following an author's thought from beginning to end. And it was uncomfortable. Painful, almost. Like exercising a muscle that had atrophied from years of disuse. But something happened. Slowly. Gradually. Questions started arising again. Real questions, born of genuine engagement. They found themselves arguing with the author in the margins, testing ideas, connecting concepts to things they'd read years ago when they still cared about reading. And then maybe 50 pages in, maybe more, they felt it. That old electric thrill. That sense of discovery. That feeling of their mind being stretched, challenged, awakened. They'd forgotten how good it felt to actually think. This is what sloth really is. Not laziness on the couch, though that can be a symptom, but spiritual apathy, moral indifference, the slow death of care. Sloth is when you stop engaging deeply with anything. When you take every shortcut, choose every easy path, avoid every effort. When you settle for summaries instead of sources, explanations instead of experiences, other people's thoughts instead of your own. Sloth is refusing to do the good that you're capable of doing. Not because you can't, but because you can't be bothered. Because it's hard. Because it requires effort. Because caring is exhausting and it's easier to just not. The desert monks who first identified aestia called it the noonday demon, that restless, listless feeling that hits in the middle of the day, in the middle of life, when the initial enthusiasm has worn off and the finish line is still far away. That moment when you think, what's the point? Why bother? Does any of this matter? And instead of pushing through, instead of rekindling the fire, you just check out. You go through the motions without heart. You do the minimum. You settle for good enough. Sloth is the student who stops really learning, the employee who stops really trying, the spouse who stops really loving, the Christian who stops really praying. Not because they've rejected these things, but because they've become apathetic to them. And it's insidious because it happens so gradually. One shortcut at a time. One compromise at a time. One moment of I'll put in real effort next time, that becomes a habit of never putting in real effort at all. The Bible has strong words about sloth, though it usually uses the term laziness rather than aestia. Proverbs is full of warnings. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. 6:10-11. The sluggard's craving will be the death of him, because his hands refuse to work. 21:25. Sluggards do not plow in season, so at harvest time they look but find nothing. 20:4. But Jesus addresses the spiritual dimension of sloth most powerfully in the parable of the talents. A master gives 3 servants resources to steward. 2 of them invest, take risks, work hard, and produce returns. The third buries his talent in the ground, doesn't waste it, doesn't steal it, just doesn't do anything with it. When the master returns, he's harsh with the third servant, you wicked and slothful servant. Not just slothful, wicked. Because the refusal to use what you've been given, the refusal to engage with your calling, the refusal to do the good you're capable of doing, that's not neutral. It's evil. The servant had everything he needed. The talent was real. The opportunity was there. He chose not to engage. He chose apathy over effort. And he lost everything. We live in an age designed to enable sloth. Everything is optimized for minimum effort, maximum convenience. Don't want to read? Here's a summary. Don't want to think? Here's what to think. Don't want to wrestle with complexity? Here's a simple answer. We have AI that writes our emails, our papers, our thoughts. We have apps that curate our reading, pre-digest our news, tell us what's important so we don't have to figure it out ourselves. We can outsource everything, not just physical labor, but intellectual effort, moral reasoning, spiritual discipline. There's always a shortcut, always an easier way, always someone or something else that can do the hard work for us. And in the process, we atrophy. Our attention spans shrink. Our capacity for sustained thought diminishes. Our tolerance for difficulty decreases. We become less capable of the very things that make us human: deep thought, hard work, genuine care. The researcher in our story represents all of us. We've all taken shortcuts. We've all chosen the easy path. We've all felt the relief of not having to try so hard. But we've also, if we're honest, felt the loss. The sense that something precious is slipping away. The knowledge that we're capable of more but choosing less. The quiet despair of a life lived on autopilot, going through motions without meaning. It's important to distinguish sloth from clinical depression. Depression is an illness, a real physiological condition that robs people of energy, joy, and the ability to function. It's not a choice. It's not a sin. It's a sickness that requires treatment. Sloth, by contrast, is a choice. It's the refusal to engage even when you could. It's choosing apathy over effort, choosing numbness over the risk of caring. But they can look similar from the outside. Both involve lack of energy, lack of motivation, lack of engagement. The difference is internal. Depression robs you of the ability to care. Sloth is the choice not to care. If you genuinely can't engage, if you're struggling with depression or another mental health condition, that's not sloth. That's illness, and you need help, not condemnation. But if you can engage, if you have the capacity but just don't want to do the hard work, that's sloth. And that's something you can, with Yahweh's help, choose to fight. The opposite of sloth isn't frenetic activity. It's not busyness. It's diligence, steady, faithful engagement with what matters. And zeal, passionate care for the things of Yahweh. Romans 12 verse 11 says, "Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord." Keep your spiritual fervor. Don't let the fire go out. Don't settle into apathy. Stay engaged. Stay passionate. Stay alive. Colossians 3 verse 23 instructs, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters." All your heart. Not minimum effort. Not just enough to get by. All your heart, in your work, your relationships, your spiritual life, everything. The antidote to sloth is rekindling the fire. Choosing to care again. Deciding that some things are worth the effort, worth the difficulty, worth the sustained engagement. It's countercultural. Everything in our world pushes toward optimization, efficiency, minimal effort. But the life of the Spirit requires something different. It requires showing up, doing the work, caring enough to try. But here's what makes sloth particularly deadly: it directly opposes love. Love, as C.S. Lewis wrote, is not just a feeling, it's a decision to seek the good of another, regardless of cost. Love requires effort. Love requires engagement. Love requires care. Sloth says, "I can't be bothered." Love says, "You're worth the effort." Jesus didn't take shortcuts in his love for us. He didn't optimize the crucifixion for efficiency. He didn't outsource our redemption to someone else. He engaged fully, suffered completely, gave everything. And he calls us to the same kind of love. To engage fully with him, with others, with the good work he's given us to do. When we refuse, when we check out, tune out, stop caring, we're not just being lazy. We're refusing to love. We're choosing ourselves over others. We're saying, "My comfort matters more than your need. My ease matters more than my calling." And that's sin. That's deadly. That's the slow spiritual death of Astia. Sloth is subtle. It's comfortable. It's easy. And that's exactly what makes it deadly. But here's the hope: the capacity to care is still in you. The fire can be rekindled. The work can be done. It starts with a countercultural decision. To sit with one difficult book. To have one real conversation. To pray one genuine prayer. To do one thing with your whole heart instead of a dozen things with half your attention. To choose engagement over apathy. To choose effort over ease. To choose life over the slow death of not caring. The path is open. It always has been. The only question is, will you take it? The medieval mind loved order. Loved systems. Loved taking complex, messy reality and organizing it into comprehensible frameworks. They created elaborate taxonomies of angels, detailed maps of purgatory, intricate hierarchies of knowledge. Everything had its place, its category, its relationship to everything else. So when medieval theologians and philosophers inherited the 7 deadly sins from the early church, they didn't just accept the list and move on. They asked deeper questions. How do these sins relate to each other? Where do they come from? What do they produce? How do they work in the human heart? And in answering those questions, they developed something remarkable, a psychological framework for understanding human fallenness that's still remarkably accurate 15 centuries later. Let me take you into the medieval mind and show you how they mapped the landscape of sin with a precision that modern psychology is only beginning to appreciate. Medieval writers didn't see the 7 deadly sins as just a list, 7 unrelated problems that happen to be grouped together. They saw them as a family tree. A genealogy of evil, if you will. Each deadly sin, they argued, gives birth to clusters of related sins. Pride is the mother who births contempt, disobedience, vainglory. Greed spawns theft, fraud, treachery. Lust produces fornication, adultery, incest. Envy gives birth to hatred, gossip, rejoicing in another's misfortune. It's a brilliant insight. Sins aren't isolated acts. They're part of families, part of patterns, part of systems that generate more and more dysfunction. Think about it. If you're enslaved to pride, you don't just struggle with pride in isolation. Pride produces a whole ecosystem of secondary sins. It makes you contemptuous of others. You look down on people who aren't as smart, successful, spiritual as you. It makes you disobedient. You resist legitimate authority because you think you know better. It makes you vain, constantly seeking recognition, fishing for compliments, needing to be seen and admired. Each of these secondary sins flows naturally from the root sin of pride. They're not separate problems, they're offspring of the parent sin. The medieval theologians catalogued these family trees in meticulous detail. Gregory the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Peter Lombard, they all created elaborate charts showing which sins begot which other sins. It looked like a genealogy in the Old Testament. Pride begot vainglory, vainglory begot hypocrisy, hypocrisy begot discord, and so on. This wasn't just academic exercise. It had profound pastoral implications. Because if you understand the family tree, you can trace symptoms back to their root. If you're struggling with gossip, envy might be the parent sin. If you can't stop scrolling social media for validation, pride might be the root. If you're caught in sexual sin, lust is the obvious parent, but greed might be involved too, wanting to possess, to consume, to take what isn't yours. Deal with the root, and you can cut off all the branches at once. Keep pruning individual branches while ignoring the root, and they'll just keep growing back. But perhaps the most sophisticated medieval framework came from Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican friar who synthesized Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy into a comprehensive system that still shapes Catholic thought today. Aquinas looked at the 7 deadly sins and asked, what do they all have in common? What's the fundamental problem they're all expressing? His answer, they're all misdirected attempts to find happiness. Think about that for a moment. Aquinas wasn't saying people sin because they're stupid or because they love evil for its own sake. He was saying people sin because they're seeking something good, happiness, fulfillment, satisfaction, but they're seeking it in the wrong places, in the wrong ways. Every sin, Aquinas argued, is a disordered love. Not the absence of love, but love aimed at the wrong object or pursued in the wrong measure. He identified 3 basic ways we go wrong in seeking happiness. First, through misdirected love of self. This is pride, when self-love becomes excessive, when you make yourself the center of the universe, when you seek happiness in your own excellence rather than in Yahweh's glory. Second, through misdirected love of possessions. This is greed, when you seek happiness in having things, in accumulating wealth, in material security rather than in Yahweh's provision. Third, through misdirected love of bodily pleasures. This includes lust, gluttony, and in some ways sloth, when you seek happiness in physical gratification, in satisfying appetites, in comfort and ease rather than in spiritual goods. And cutting across all of these, envy and wrath. Envy is disordered because it's saddened by another's good instead of rejoicing in it. Wrath is disordered because it seeks revenge or destruction beyond what justice requires. But notice Aquinas' fundamental insight. The problem isn't that we're seeking happiness. Yahweh created us to seek happiness. Augustine famously said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." We're designed to seek fulfillment, to pursue satisfaction, to long for joy. The problem is we keep looking in the wrong places. We keep trying to find in created things what can only be found in the Creator. We keep seeking happiness in self, possessions, and pleasures instead of in Yahweh. And the tragedy, the bitter irony, is that these misdirected pursuits never deliver what they promise. Pride promises significance, but delivers isolation. Greed promises security, but delivers anxiety. Lust promises intimacy, but delivers emptiness. Gluttony promises satisfaction, but delivers craving. Envy promises validation, but delivers bitterness. Wrath promises justice, but delivers destruction. Sloth promises rest, but delivers meaninglessness. We're seeking happiness in wells that can never satisfy our thirst, and we keep coming back to them again and again, confused about why we're still thirsty. The medieval theologians also refined the terminology. These aren't just deadly sins, though that term stuck in popular usage. The technical term is capital vices. Capital comes from the Latin caput, meaning head. We talked about this earlier, but it's worth returning to because the medieval thinkers really developed this concept. Capital vices are heads, sources, fountains from which other sins flow. They're generative, they produce, they spawn, they give birth to countless other sins. Think of pride as a factory that manufactures contempt, disobedience, presumption, vainglory, hypocrisy, and dozens of other products. Or think of it as a virus that mutates into different strains depending on the context. Same underlying pathogen, different symptoms. This is why they're called deadly or mortal, not because committing them once instantly damns you, but because they're lethal to spiritual life if left unchecked. They kill grace. They separate you from Yahweh. They corrupt everything they touch. And they're self-perpetuating. Sin produces more sin. Each act of pride makes the next act of pride easier. Each indulgence of lust strengthens the habit of lust. Each expression of wrath makes you more wrathful. The medieval mystics talked about sin as a kind of spiritual gravity. The more you have, the more it pulls you down, and the harder it becomes to escape. You don't just commit sins, you become sinful. The acts shape the actor. The choices form character. The vices become virtue's dark mirror, stable dispositions toward evil rather than good. What's remarkable about the medieval framework is how psychologically sophisticated it was. Remember, this was centuries before Freud, before Jung, before modern psychology. But these theologians understood human nature with startling precision. They understood addiction before we had the word. They knew that repeated indulgence of a vice creates a bondage that reason alone can't break. That you can know something is destroying you and still be unable to stop doing it. That sin isn't primarily an intellectual problem, it's a problem of disordered loves, of malformed habits, of slavery to passions. They understood rationalization. They cataloged all the ways pride justifies itself: I'm just being confident; greed excuses itself, I'm just being prudent; lust defends itself, I'm just appreciating beauty; sloth rationalizes itself, I'm just taking necessary rest. They understood the progressive nature of sin. How it starts small, just a thought, just a small compromise, and grows into something monstrous. How you never intend to end up where you end up, but one small step leads to another, and another, until you're somewhere you never meant to be. They understood shame and its effects. How sin makes us hide from Yahweh and from each other. How it distorts our self-perception, making us either inflate ourselves, pride, or deflate ourselves, despair. How it creates cycles of sin, shame, more sin that are incredibly difficult to break. They understood the social dimension of sin. How the 7 deadly sins don't just damage individuals but corrupt communities, institutions, entire societies. How pride creates hierarchies of contempt. How greed creates systems of exploitation. How envy poisons relationships. How wrath destroys peace. All of this psychological insight, embedded in theological frameworks, developed through careful observation of human nature and centuries of spiritual direction, confession, and pastoral care. And because the medieval thinkers understood sin so psychologically, their approach to dealing with it was surprisingly therapeutic, long before therapy existed as a discipline. They didn't just say stop sinning. They developed detailed programs for addressing root causes, for forming new habits, for gradually healing disordered loves. For each capital vice, they prescribed a corresponding virtue: humility against pride, generosity against greed, chastity against lust, kindness against envy, temperance against gluttony, patience against wrath, diligence against sloth. But they understood that you can't just will yourself into virtue. You have to practice it. Small steps, repeated over time, forming new patterns, creating new habits. You have to replace the vice with something better, not just try to stop the vice through sheer willpower. They emphasized examination of conscience, daily reflection on where you went wrong, where you succeeded, what patterns you're noticing. Not for the sake of wallowing in guilt, but for the sake of self-awareness, for understanding your particular weaknesses and temptations. They taught about occasions of sin, the situations, relationships, environments that make certain sins more likely. And they advised avoiding those occasions when possible, or at least being especially vigilant when you can't avoid them. They practiced confession, The therapeutic value of articulating your sins out loud to another person, of being known in your weakness and still being accepted, of receiving assurance of forgiveness, of being accountable to someone who knows your struggles. All of this sounds remarkably like modern cognitive behavioral therapy, doesn't it? Identifying thought patterns, forming new habits, understanding triggers, practicing accountability. The medieval spiritual directors were doing therapy centuries before we called it that. The medieval framework reached its artistic peak in Dante's Divine Comedy, particularly in the Purgatorio. Dante structured his vision of purgatory around the 7 deadly sins, 7 terraces on Mount Purgatory where souls are purified of each vice in turn. What's brilliant about Dante's vision is that the punishments fit the sins perfectly. They're not arbitrary tortures, they're therapeutic correctives designed to cure the soul of its disordered loves. The proud are forced to walk bent over under heavy stones, learning humility. The envious have their eyes sewn shut, learning not to covet what they see others have. The wrathful walk through clouds of acrid smoke, learning that wrath obscures vision and chokes life. Each terrace is a kind of spiritual rehabilitation, where the soul learns the opposite virtue by experiencing the consequences and corrections of the vice. And notice, in Dante's vision, everyone in purgatory eventually makes it to paradise. The 7 deadly sins are deadly serious, but they're not hopeless. With time, with grace, with willing cooperation in the process of purification, healing is possible. Change is possible. Freedom is possible. That's the hope embedded in the medieval framework. Yes, sin is serious. Yes, it's destructive. Yes, it corrupts and kills. But Yahweh is in the business of healing, of restoration, of making all things new. You might wonder, does a medieval psychological framework have anything to offer us today? We have actual psychology now. We have neuroscience, brain imaging, pharmaceutical interventions. Why would we need 13th century categories? But here's the thing, modern psychology is good at describing mechanisms, how the brain works, what neural pathways do, what chemical imbalances occur. What it often struggles with is meaning, purpose, moral formation. It can tell you how you got to where you are, but it has a harder time telling you where you should be going or why. The medieval framework offers something different, a vision of human flourishing, a map of virtue, a diagnosis that includes not just symptoms but spiritual sickness, not just behaviors but loves. And their insight about capital vices, that there are root sins that generate clusters of other sins, is profoundly practical. Modern therapy often treats symptoms individually, anxiety, depression, addiction, relationship problems, each addressed separately. But what if they're all branches of the same root? What if your anxiety and your addiction and your relationship problems all flow from the same disordered love, the same capital vice? Deal with the root, and everything changes. A person struggling with constant anxiety might discover that the root is pride, the need to control everything, the inability to trust, the burden of maintaining a perfect image. Address the pride, learn humility and trust, and the anxiety begins to heal. Someone cycling through addictions, food, alcohol, pornography, shopping, might discover that the root is sloth or gluttony, the attempt to numb spiritual emptiness with physical consumption. Address that misdirected search for satisfaction, find true fulfillment in Yahweh, and the compulsions lose their power. The medieval framework helps us see these connections, trace symptoms to sources, understand ourselves not just as collections of problems but as integrated persons with disordered loves that can be healed and reordered. But perhaps the most important thing the medieval theologians understood is that knowledge alone doesn't save us. Understanding the framework doesn't automatically fix the problem. Thomas Aquinas, for all his brilliance in analyzing the structure of sin and virtue, was adamant, we need grace. We need Yahweh's help. We can't heal our disordered loves through sheer willpower or perfect understanding. The 7 deadly sins reveal our need for a savior. They show us that we're not just making mistakes, we're enslaved to patterns we can't break on our own, pursuing happiness in ways that never satisfy, building our lives on foundations that always collapse. And they point us to the only solution, the transforming work of the Holy Spirit, the grace of Yahweh that heals what we cannot heal ourselves, the love of Christ that reorders our disordered loves. The medieval framework is diagnostic. It helps us understand what's wrong. But diagnosis isn't cure. The cure is grace, freely offered, patiently applied, slowly transforming us from the inside out into people who love rightly, who seek happiness where it can actually be found, who are free from the slavery of sin. The medieval theologians gave us tools. Not to condemn ourselves, but to understand ourselves. Not to wallow in guilt, but to identify what needs healing. Not to earn salvation, that's by grace alone, but to cooperate with the grace that's already at work. They mapped the landscape of the soul with remarkable precision, and their maps are still accurate, still useful, still able to guide us home. Because that's what all of this is about, finding our way home. To Yahweh, to ourselves, to the life we were created to live. The 7 deadly sins show us how we've lost the way. The corresponding virtues show us how to find it again. And grace, always grace, provides the power to walk it. We've walked through the 7 deadly sins together: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. We've explored their origins in the Egyptian desert, their refinement by Pope Gregory, their psychological sophistication in medieval thought. We've seen how each one works, how each one destroys, how each one reflects fundamental human struggles that haven't changed in 2,000 years. But before we close, there's one more part of the story to tell. What happened to this framework after the Middle Ages? How did it evolve? How did it spread beyond the church and into the broader culture? And why, in an increasingly secular world, do these categories still resonate so powerfully? Because the 7 deadly sins didn't stay in theological textbooks. They escaped into art, literature, music, film, psychology, popular culture. They became part of how Western civilization thinks about morality, human nature, and what it means to go wrong. Let me show you how this ancient framework became a cultural legacy that still shapes how we understand ourselves today. One of the most common ways people encounter the 7 deadly sins today is paired with the 7 heavenly virtues, the idea that each sin has a corresponding opposite virtue. You've probably seen the pairings. Humility against pride. Charity, or generosity, against greed. Chastity against lust. Kindness against envy. Temperance against gluttony. Patience against wrath. Diligence against sloth. It's neat, symmetrical, easy to remember. 7 sins, 7 virtues, perfect opposition. Teachers love it. Catechists use it. It shows up in everything from Sunday school lessons to fantasy novels. But here's what most people don't know: this pairing is a later pedagogical device. It's not original to the tradition, and different authors actually pair them differently. Some medieval writers paired pride with humility, yes, but others paired it with love or faith. Some paired greed with charity, others with generosity or justice. The pairings weren't standardized, they were teaching tools that different teachers adapted for different audiences and purposes. And that's actually beautiful, when you think about it. It means the tradition was alive, flexible, responsive to different contexts and needs. The framework wasn't a rigid system handed down from on high, it was a living tool that teachers shaped to help their students understand spiritual reality. The most influential pairing came from the poet Prudentius in his work Psychomachia, literally Battle of the Soul, written around 400 AD, even before Gregory's final list of 7. Prudentius depicted virtues and vices as warriors in epic battle: patience fighting wrath, humility battling pride, chastity opposing lust. This allegorical battle became incredibly popular in medieval art and literature. You can see it in cathedral sculptures, in illuminated manuscripts, in stained glass windows across Europe. The soul as a battlefield, virtues and vices in cosmic struggle for dominance. It's vivid imagery, and it captures something true: the Christian life is a fight. Not against other people, but against these disordered tendencies in our own hearts. We're all battlefields. The question is which side we're fighting for. But the specific pairings? Those were teaching tools, not doctrine. Helpful, yes. Inspired by long tradition, absolutely. But not the only way to think about how virtue opposes vice. Here's another thing that might surprise you: the number 7 wasn't always set in stone. We've talked about how Evagrius originally had 8 evil thoughts. Gregory condensed them to 7. But the story doesn't end there. Some medieval sources spoke of 9 capital vices. They'd add things like sadness, which Gregory had dropped, or vainglory, which he'd folded into pride, back in as separate categories. Others included despair, that deep spiritual hopelessness that makes you give up on Yahweh's mercy, as its own deadly sin. Some lists included fear as a capital vice, not healthy caution, but the kind of paralyzing fear that keeps you from doing good, from taking risks for the kingdom, from trusting Yahweh. Why the variations? Because teachers were responding to what they saw in their communities, in their time, in their context. An abbot in a medieval monastery might emphasize different vices than a parish priest in a city, who might emphasize different ones than a missionary in a new land. The framework was descriptive, not prescriptive. It was trying to map reality, not create it. And reality is complex, messy, doesn't always fit into neat categories of exactly 7. Modern writers continue this tradition of expansion. Some psychologists have argued for adding things like apathy, distinct from sloth, or schadenfreude, taking pleasure in others' misfortune, related to envy but with its own dynamics, or despair, spiritual hopelessness that might be worse than any of the traditional 7. And they might have a point. The 7 deadly sins were never meant to be an exhaustive list of everything that can go wrong with the human heart. They were meant to be a helpful framework for understanding major patterns of spiritual dysfunction. If adding an 8th or 9th category helps people understand themselves better, helps them identify and address real spiritual problems, then add it. The point was never to preserve a magic number. The point was always to help souls find healing. But while theologians were debating the precise number and pairing of sins and virtues, the 7 deadly sins were escaping into broader culture in ways that would shape Western civilization. Dante's Divine Comedy, which we've mentioned before, made the 7 sins visual, visceral, unforgettable. Millions of people who never read a theological treatise read Dante, or at least knew the stories, saw the art inspired by it, absorbed its vision of sin and redemption. Medieval artists painted the 7 deadly sins everywhere. On church walls, on altarpieces, in prayer books. Not just as abstract concepts but as personified figures, as vivid scenes of temptation and consequence, as warnings and teachings accessible to people who couldn't read. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales features characters who embody different deadly sins, the wife of Bath representing lust, the pardoner representing greed, the parson offering the antidote of virtue. Renaissance artists like Hieronymus Bosch created nightmarish visions of sin and its consequences. The 7 deadly sins and the 4 last things shows each sin in brutal surreal detail that still disturbs viewers today. The framework shaped morality plays, mystery plays, allegorical dramas performed in town squares and church courtyards. The character of pride, the character of gluttony, the character of sloth, not just concepts but characters, making abstract vices concrete and memorable. And it kept going. Marlowe's Dr. Faustus in the Renaissance. Milton's Paradise Lost in the 17th century. The 7 deadly sins were the vocabulary through which Western literature talked about human failure and moral struggle. By the time you get to modern literature and film, the 7 deadly sins are everywhere, sometimes explicitly, like in the film Seven or in the Full Metal Alchemist series, sometimes as underlying structure, like in The Lord of the Rings, where different characters struggle with different vices. They've become archetypal, part of the deep grammar of storytelling in Western culture. You don't have to be Christian to recognize them, to use them, to find them compelling as a framework for understanding character and conflict. Ironically, as Western culture became more secular in the modern period, psychology began rediscovering what medieval theologians had mapped centuries earlier. Freud talked about the ID, uncontrolled appetites, drives, desires. That's basically the 7 deadly sins operating below the level of conscious control. Jung talked about the shadow, the dark side of the personality that we deny and project onto others. The 7 deadly sins live in the shadow, the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. Cognitive behavioral therapy identifies cognitive distortions, patterns of thinking that don't match reality and cause problems. Pride's inflated self-assessment, envy's comparison trap, sloth's rationalization, these are all cognitive distortions the medievals identified long before CBT existed. Addiction counseling talks about character defects and moral inventories, identifying patterns of selfishness, resentment, fear that drive destructive behavior. That's the 7 deadly sins by another name. Positive psychology has recently focused on character strengths and virtues, and guess what? They look remarkably similar to the heavenly virtues that oppose the deadly sins. The framework keeps getting rediscovered because it maps something real. Human nature hasn't changed. The ways we go wrong haven't changed. Our disordered loves, our misdirected searches for happiness, our capital vices that spawn countless other problems, they're the same today as they were in 4th century Egypt or 13th century Paris or 21st century California. The language changes. The cultural context changes. But the underlying reality, the human condition, the struggle between virtue and vice, the need for healing and transformation, that remains constant. In recent decades, the 7 deadly sins have been thoroughly secularized. You can find them in video games, anime, comic books, fantasy novels, often detached from any Christian context, just used as a cool framework for characters or plot structure. And that's okay, actually. It shows how deeply these categories have penetrated the cultural imagination. They've become part of the shared vocabulary, the common property of the culture, not just the possession of the church. But something gets lost in the secularization. When the 7 deadly sins become just character types or plot devices, divorced from any sense of actual sin, actual moral reality, actual need for redemption, they become toothless. Entertaining, maybe. Aesthetically interesting, but not transformative. The power of the original framework was that it told the truth about us. Not just here's an interesting personality type, but here's what's actually wrong with you, here's why you're suffering, here's what needs to change. It had teeth because it was connected to ultimate reality, to Yahweh's design for human flourishing, to the objective difference between virtue and vice, to the real consequences of disordered loves. Strip that away, and you have an interesting taxonomy but not a tool for transformation. You have labels but not healing. Still, even secularized, even domesticated, the 7 deadly sins in pop culture at least keep the categories alive. They keep people thinking about pride and greed and lust and envy as problems, as things to be aware of, as patterns that lead to suffering. And maybe, just maybe, when someone encounters the full framework in its original spiritual context, they'll recognize it. Oh, this is what that was about. This is the reality those stories were pointing to. So why do the 7 deadly sins still matter? Why should anyone care about categories developed by medieval monks? Because they're true. They accurately describe how human beings actually work, how we actually fail, how we actually suffer. You don't need to be Christian to recognize pride in yourself or others. You don't need to be religious to see greed destroying lives and communities. You don't need to believe in Yahweh to notice how lust reduces people to objects, how envy poisons relationships, how wrath destroys peace. The framework works because it maps reality. And reality doesn't change just because our cultural assumptions do. We live in an age that desperately needs this wisdom. We're more anxious, more depressed, more addicted, more divided than perhaps ever before. And underneath all of it, the 7 deadly sins. Our anxiety often flows from pride, the need to control, to maintain image, to be self-sufficient. Our depression often connects to sloth, the loss of meaning, the refusal to engage, the spiritual apathy. Our addictions are forms of gluttony and lust, attempts to fill spiritual emptiness with physical consumption. Our political divisions are fueled by wrath and envy, the inability to see opponents as human, the resentment of those who have what we want. The problems are ancient. The framework is ancient. But both are utterly contemporary. And the solution, transformation through grace, the healing of disordered loves, the patient work of virtue formation, that's what our culture desperately needs and largely doesn't know how to access. But let me be clear about one thing. The 7 deadly sins were never meant to be a tool for condemnation. Never meant to be a weapon to beat yourself or others with. Never meant to add to the burden of shame and guilt that so many people already carry. They were meant to be diagnostic. To help you understand what's wrong so it can be healed. To identify the roots so you can address them instead of just managing symptoms forever. They were meant to point you toward freedom. Because you can't be free from something you can't name. You can't fight an enemy you can't see. You can't heal from a disease you don't understand. The 7 deadly sins give you vocabulary for your struggles. They help you see patterns. They connect symptoms to sources. They show you that you're not uniquely broken, you're participating in ancient, universal human struggles. Others have fought these battles before you. Others have found healing. Others have discovered that grace is real and transformation is possible. That's the hope embedded in the framework. Yes, it diagnoses, but it also prescribes. For every sin, a virtue. For every vice, a corresponding grace. For every disordered love, the possibility of reordered affections. You're not stuck. You're not hopeless. You're not beyond redemption. The 7 deadly sins might describe where you are, but they don't determine where you'll end up. We've covered a lot of ground together in these sections. We started with the origins of the 7 deadly sins in the Egyptian desert, where monks first identified these patterns of temptation and struggle. We trace their development through Pope Gregory's refinement, through medieval theological sophistication, through artistic expression and cultural penetration. We explored each sin in depth: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, sloth. We saw how they work, how they destroy, how they disguise themselves, how they flow from misdirected loves and searches for happiness in places it can never be found. We examined the psychological framework, the family trees of sin, the therapeutic wisdom embedded in centuries of spiritual direction. And we've seen how this ancient framework remains relevant, remains true, remains able to help us understand ourselves and find healing. But knowledge alone doesn't save. Understanding the framework doesn't automatically fix the problem. At some point, the diagnosis has to lead to treatment. The awareness has to lead to action. The conviction has to lead to repentance and transformation. So if you've recognized yourself in these descriptions, if you've seen your struggles reflected in these patterns, that's the first step. Self-awareness is crucial, but it's only the first step. The next step is honesty, not just with yourself, but with Yahweh. Bringing your struggles into the light, confessing them, admitting that you can't fix yourself through willpower alone, acknowledging your need for grace. And then comes the patient work of transformation, replacing vices with virtues, one small choice at a time. Humility instead of pride, generosity instead of greed, chastity instead of lust, kindness instead of envy, temperance instead of gluttony, patience instead of wrath, diligence instead of sloth. It's slow work. It's often frustrating work. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Progress that's hard to see day to day but becomes visible over months and years. But it's possible. Because Yahweh is in the business of transformation. He specializes in taking people enslaved to sin and setting them free. Taking hearts curved in on themselves and opening them up to love of God and neighbor. Taking the deadly and making it alive again. The 7 deadly sins show us how we've lost our way. The corresponding virtues show us the path home. And grace, always grace, provides the power to walk it. This isn't just about behavior modification or moral improvement or becoming a slightly better version of yourself. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be. About learning to love rightly, to seek happiness where it can actually be found, to live the abundant life that Jesus promised. It's about freedom. Real freedom. Not the fake freedom of do whatever you want, which is actually slavery to your worst impulses. But the genuine freedom of being what you were created to be, loving what you were designed to love, finding satisfaction in what actually satisfies. That's what the 7 deadly sins are ultimately about. Not condemnation, but liberation. Not shame, but healing. Not despair, but hope. Because the deadly can become life-giving. The vices can be transformed into virtues. The prodigal can come home. The lost can be found. The dead can be raised to life. That's the promise of the gospel. That's the hope that undergirds this entire framework. That's why these categories matter, why they've endured, why they still speak to us across the centuries. Not because they're elegant or interesting or culturally significant, though they're all of those things, but because they're true. And because they point beyond themselves to the one who is truth, who came to set captives free, who offers living water that actually satisfies, who promises that whoever comes to him will never hunger or thirst again. So come. Bring your pride, your greed, your lust, your envy, your gluttony, your wrath, your sloth. Bring all of it into the light. Let it be named, understood, diagnosed. And then let it be healed. By the grace of Yahweh. By the power of the Spirit. By the love of Christ that casts out fear and covers a multitude of sins and makes all things new. The 7 deadly sins describe the journey away from home. But grace, amazing grace, shows us the way back. And it's never too late to start walking.